Welcome everyone to this RSS scientific meeting on protecting confidentiality and privacy in clinical trial and medical data sets. So before I begin, there are a few housekeeping announcements. Firstly, you may have noticed that, hopefully you noticed that the event is now being recorded. And the plan is to make this session available later. If you don't want any part of your contribution released, we have a team that can sort of redact bits of the session. So if you could please let us know as soon as possible after the event. We plan to release sort of the recording of the session within a couple of weeks of the state. So if you could let us know as soon as possible if you don't want any contributions made available. If you contributed something, you can let us know after the event as soon as possible. Would be great. I think those are the main housekeeping announcements. I believe everyone should be muted. That needs to be. If you do unmute yourself at some point to ask a question, if you could just remember to mute yourself afterwards, that would be great. Without any more housekeeping, I'll just briefly introduce who we have here. So I'm the chair, Robin Mitra. I've actually recently moved to Cardiff University, only just about a month ago. So I've got a joint appointment there at this. Well, the position is jointly funded between the School of Maths at Cardiff and the Office for National Statistics. And so I'll be chairing this session. We have three really great speakers here. Really pleased that they're all able to present here. So firstly, we'll have Nicola Stingelin. Sorry, I'm sorry. Nicola. I think I may have pronounced your surname wrong. Sorry, but she is an ethics expert at the University of Basel's Institute for Bio and Medical Ethics. We then will have Catherine Tucker presenting, who is the data privacy technical lead at Roche. We'll then have about a 30-minute break, just in keeping with usual sessions. I think it'll be good to have a little break, and people can, of course, feel free to have discussions at that point as well. But a bit of a break, around half an hour before our final speaker of the meeting, Mark Elliott, who is a professor of data science at the University of Manchester. We'll then end with a panel discussion that would take place at about 5:30, from approximately, assuming everything goes to time. We'll have sort of time in between talks for questions and general sort of clarification questions as well. So obviously, please do ask questions. Because it's fully online, we're all in a slightly new medium here. So what I'm suggesting we do is put questions through on the chat, or the other option could be, if you want to ask a question, if you want to just type to say I have a question to ask at the end or something, then I'll know who wants to ask questions, and then I can bring them in, in the order that they've been received on the chat. So that's what I'm suggesting we do. But if you do want to ask the question during the talk, there is a hands up feature in Teams, so I hope people have access to that. If you don't, then maybe you could also put something on the chat. But there's a hands up message sort of feature there. So if you want to ask a question, if you put the hands up feature on, then I can also bring you in to ask a question to the speaker. I think that's all I wanted to say. Really, we should get onto the talks. So I think without further ado, I'll pass over to Nicola, who is going to be talking on data confidentiality and moribund construction.
Hi, can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen, Nicola.
And you can hear me as well?
Yeah, no problem. No problem.
Welcome, everybody. Just for your information, if somebody has something they really urgently want to say, or it's important for understanding, and they raise their hand, assuming I'm not too much in full stream, I'm more than happy to stop and discuss as I go along a little bit, because I don't have that much material, because I thought I wanted to leave time to discuss. When we started looking at this event, it was kind of in that other world before COVID. And I mean, at the moment, anything I'm looking at ethics-wise is all kind of blighted or highlighted or coloured by COVID. And I mean, I think the presentation today, certainly in the area of big data, COVID, has certainly informed a lot of my thinking, confirmed some of the wacky hypotheses I was thinking about. But anyway, I'll be talking a lot about COVID. Okay, all these COVID background to a lot of my thinking automatically. And if I cough, it should not be COVID, but we haven't yet been told it can be passed over the computer. Now then, the event, the title is Protecting Confidentiality and Privacy in Clinical Trial and Medical Data Sets. And for me as an ethicist, I say, well, my first question, well, why? Why should we be particularly protecting why this thing about confidentiality and privacy? And by the way, thank you very, very much, people organising for the meeting, for differentiating between confidentiality and privacy. Technically speaking, it's data that's confidential and a person is private, but I know the terms do get a bit kind of mulched around. So my question is, why should we be protecting confidentiality? You know, I'll be focusing on confidentiality, not privacy. The perspective I'm going to be looking at, of course, is data confidentiality perspective, data ethics and governance. Okay, just very, very boring housekeeping. Ethics, it's one of those terms which can be strangely used. And I'm talking about ethics in its driest, most boring possible form as a branch of moral philosophy. We're trying to be react in order to just life, act in a good and just manner, and why. We can't just say that's what we should do. We have to say why we should be doing it. And a big thing which often concerns me a lot is how can we make sure that our actions are coherent and consistent. I promise you, I hope to get more interesting than this start. But anyway, that's how I'm using the term ethics. Let's set the scene to try and get us into the mood frame of ethics, data, big data in the healthcare area. And in fact, I'm starting by something which was not necessarily health related. And this seems like 50 million years ago, and it wasn't so long ago that, you know, Cambridge Analytica was at the centre of so much our thinking. You know, bless Mark looking a bit like a rabbit in front of the car. Oh, so sweet. That this was certainly a very, very interesting and important development in raising discussions about personal data, how we should be using it when we give it into the public domain, with or without consent. How do we really want it to be used? How do we not want it to be used, etc. So it does really seem so long ago, but certainly it's an event which has informed a lot of the debates. Coming back to the reality, wow. And at the moment, as I say, for somebody who's interested in data ethics, every day is either a picnic or a nightmare, depending on how things are going. And this was just a screenshot I took from yesterday, I think, NHS COVID Data Store. And I think it's very interesting as a background to data ethics at the moment, where we are focused, I'm afraid, on the UK at the moment, where we can see the importance of data health sets in a pandemic situation. NHS working to provide a national response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And data is providing us with the evidence to help keep the public safe and provide the best possible response to the virus. That's all cool, isn't it? Interesting is the next sentence, that in the modern data era in healthcare, research, clinical trials, whatever, you know, the old silos of industry working and then academia really no longer exist. Well, at the moment, they don't exist so strongly. And the NHS say indeed that we are working with multiple companies under strict contractual controls to support our approach. To open a little, what do you say in English? A little side question here. I mean, it certainly is very interesting how and when the NHS are sharing data with commercial companies, under what terms and conditions, but that would be a subject of another presentation completely. What's really, really, really important to note on this, sorry, to notice on this slide, sorry, is where they say all data processed in the NHS Data Store is either pseudonymized, anonymized, or aggregated, and therefore does not identify the individual. And for me, this is kind of suggesting that if it's not personal, then don't worry. And this, I think, is quite an interesting and in a way quite a disappointing statement when we're dealing with a public health emergency. And I'll be talking a lot about my central hypothesis is that our overly individualistic view of data in many ways needs to be updated. It's sometimes very relevant, of course, to ask for consent, etc., and to be concerned about confidentiality. But there are a lot of situations, COVID being perhaps one of them, a public health pandemic, where we need to start getting away from the assertions about whether it's pseudonymized, anonymized, or aggregated, because I think there are lots of very interesting ethical issues which arise. Okay, this is again setting the scene. This was something I found, it was from last year, end of last year, something that Novartis representative put out there. The modern data in the healthcare, we all know this, that real world evidence, real world data, you know, it's about money in so many ways. And I don't mean that in any negative way necessarily, but it is, you know, data is money. We all agree that the new oil is completely irrelevant as a metaphor, but nevertheless, data sets, if you've got quality, can be associated with money. I thought it was very interesting that Novartis had taken the position about real world data evidence saving because it's making their research processes better. By the way, my first career was in the pharmaceutical industry. So, you know, I have some insights into that. And their statement was in this article, evidence generated by the pharma industry is typically sequential and siloed, very interesting. And they acknowledge that we need to try mindset of the pharma industry in utilizing real world evidence data. So this is just the kind of data world we're all looking in, where big data, it's money, it's power, it's saving lives, etc. It's many things. Okay, to get on to the presentation itself more, I'm going to start off by trying to talk about some concepts and ideas that I hope I'm able to communicate to you today. Things that I'm still working on and not always clear in my own mind because there's so much happening. And the first one is the centrality of personal and non-personal data, differentiation in data ethics, that so many articles and texts and guidelines are still obsessed about this. And I think that's only part of the game. And laws that only talk about personal and then non-personal, they are missing the point, I think, about real world contemporary data issues. The next point will be classifying, defining data, data ownership, very old discussion points, but I still think highly relevant and very, very interesting, and things we always need to have in the back of my mind. What is data? Data social contract, we need to review that, and then a few concluding comments. Okay. So the centrality of this idea of the personal and non-personal medical data. And as we all know, there's a central distinction that's always made between personal and non-personal data. GDPR only covers personal data. And why are we so obsessed? Why are we so one-sidedly obsessed on data as something personal? And this is a real problem that we need to revisit. Okay, it's fair enough that personal data is seen as demanding some kind of higher level of ethics oversight and regulation compared to non-personal data. And there we have the basis being the individualistic ethics principles, which I am in no way putting to one side, but it's not the whole picture. You know, respect to the person, informed consent, etc., etc. We tend to have default situations quite often that personal data rights, the individual rights, will trump other rights and duties. Clearly one-sided, not always the case. And my question is, does this default require revision in our modern data era? Yes, I think so, very much so. And should we always give pole position to protection of individual data? No, not always. But I'm not suggesting at all that data be always seen as a public good. But I do think that in our data innovative era, the group or population level health data sets, which can be made up of personal or anonymized data or whatever, they do require a specific look at from a data ethics and governance point of view. Now then, I'd like to go back on this subject of big data, what it is today, and how I think it really needs to change the data ethics landscape to what the NHS was saying on their COVID-19 website text that I quoted earlier, where they seem to be, again, the data processed in the NHS Data Store is either pseudonymized, anonymized, or aggregated, and therefore does not identify any individual. And they seem to say, well, because that's the case, there's nothing ethical going on here. Why? And I think this is so completely wrong. And I want to try and lead you down a line of thought. I may be wrong, but I think there's something important we're at risk of missing out here. So, okay, we've got this data innovation era where we have these huge data sets. And many of the experts in different fields are telling us that if we have these huge data sets and we analyze them appropriately and adequately, let's assume that the data quality is okay, that we can then develop algorithms, etc., unless possibly the government's involved, but we'll put that to one side. But anyway, the idea is that this huge data availability is going to enable the identification or creation of strata or groups that are characterized by shared features. Looking at GWAS is the first kind of idea we all had, where you had huge data sets, medical information, you look at the genome, and you thought this big data was identifying strata groups, which means you can identify individuals. So the whole ethic architecture up until now has been starting with the individual, me, my data, my confidentiality, what have you, and it all went out from there, all the laws. And my feeling is we have a parallel world now where we have big data sets, real world data, or clinical trials, or a combination, possibly also data from the private sphere about what food we buy, etc., which if we mash that all together, theoretically, we are being sold the story that this will be predictive and enable us to say who's liable to have COVID badly, who's liable to get cancer, etc. Now, that I hope I'm making this clear, and this seems to me that if big data is increasingly the starting point from which the individual is derived, what we need is a new ethics of big data in some ways. I hope people can follow me, and I'm not being too overly complicated, but I think we're not always looking, I think, with the right lenses on the issues. Okay. So just to kind of summarize that point, the modern data ethics, big health data as a source of the personal. We have the tendential status quo, the norm of the personal, individual data as being at the start of health research, development and practice. But now, of course, we have another way where you can start with big data and concepts of individual data confidentiality as a foundational norm, no longer adequate. We still need that. And the other thing to notice is that with the big data, real world data, and all the issues of linking in data with what you've got on your shopping cart, dietary stuff, we really are looking at data sets, of course, which have many dimensions of health. I mean, this is very interesting, the work we've done in relation to COVID, where we've got some quite frightening big data sets which are looking at the socio-economic, ethnic, etc., very important data, but also politically quite hot. So again, there's so much going on that the old data confidentiality debates about informed consent and all that, it's just, we're a bit over that in some ways, I think, and we need to look elsewhere. Okay, clarifying, defining data ownership. And I know I say ownership advisedly. Sometimes one talks about ownership, and it may be fair enough sometimes to say one owns data, but I don't think it's always relevant. Data, we all know about this. We're all in the data stats world. Data is a very particular set of properties as an asset, differentiates from physical assets. They can be duplicated at near zero cost, used in multiple ways by different people without diminishing their value. On the contrary, their value often increases as they are combined with other data sets. It's not a finite resource. The use of a data set for one purpose does not inhibit the use of the same data for social or non-commercial purposes. So I mean, I find this so incredibly fascinating from an ethical point of view. The data, it's such an unusual point of view, and also actually from an economics, my first business career, I think data is such a fascinating thing. Because it is an asset, but I keep on talking about public goods with the full knowledge that data is not a true public good, but it has really very unique qualities of its own, which I think need a unique way of looking at the ethics issues. We all know the discussion surrounding what big data is, how it should be classified. It is pretty central for data confidentiality, because on the one hand, if in a certain situation you're trying to say this data is a public good, then it's a bit strange to be talking about it being confidential in a way, because if it's a public good, it should be public. I mean, I'm simplifying there, but I think, again, we need to think a bit wider than this, and that we have to also be concerned about whether we can speak of owning data or whether stewardship are appropriate and what words we use. I'm getting a bit kind of fussy here, but I do think it's important to be aware of what's going on or not. Okay. So at the moment, my thinking on this question, and I'm a very frustrating ethicist on this point, how should we classify data? The longer I look at it, and COVID has again shown to me everything I've done with COVID, it really depends on context how we should classify data. And I say this classification of data is really important for many ethical, governance, also legal issues flowing from the data, that you really can't generalize on data. What kind of data, in what context, and what we rather need, and I hate to say that, is to in a way complicate the matter and be much clearer when we're talking about data sets in the healthcare business. Is it a data set to develop an intervention which will treat individuals who have cancer? Are we talking about data relating to a public health preventive, etc.? Is it just commercial? Is it also public health estate, etc., etc.? And I hate to say it, but I think if we oversimplify, we're getting nowhere. And I think we need to be much more refined in all our considerations of data and matters associated therewith. What's the night? I always forget what my next slide's going to be. You know what I mean? Yes, another very interesting point, because I used to work in intellectual property in the pharma business, which I do think is also connected with ideas about data agreement and consent, etc., is the whole IP situation. And also data monopolies. I know some of the people on the call are very much into this. Can a data monopoly ever exist? Should it ever exist ethically? Interrelated issue, the question of ascertaining the value of data and if when compensation can be paid for access. Because if we're thinking about data being confidential, and it's in a situation where it's reasonable that I would say, this is my data, it's mine, this is valuable, it's my property, then I do think we need to be thinking again, possibly in some context, about whether some kind of benefit sharing might be appropriate, certainly on an international level, of course. We need to be very careful that we're not using data from countries without giving them some public goods back again. But it's just, these are complex things that we need to carry on looking at. Okay, data social contract, need for review. I work as a consultant for Hoffman & Ross, completely by chance. I'm on their international ethics committee. And working with them over the years, I find the idea of social contracts in the healthcare business a very, very useful frame. Also with my background in some political philosophical thinking, that I really think it's a useful frame for thinking. And first of all, the data social contract with the commercial sector. Whew. Do we need to remodel it? Do we need to define it? Yes, I do think we do. Look today whether pharmaceutical companies now, they're using real world data. They want to use it. They're using it. They're putting it in the mix with drug development, which they will then have intellectual property. Fair enough. They will make super profits. Fair enough. Which of course benefits society because we have access to healthcare, to improved healthcare. Absolutely correct. But for me, there is a question as to corporations who drive their R&D processes based on real world data. I think they can conceivably and not unreasonably be required to apply new benefit sharing models to their profit if they've got super profits or patents. And I'm not making and I'm not saying this in any critical or political way, just purely in a philosophical way of looking at what's going on and making sure we have a fair and just division of benefits coming out. Another aspect, of course, is if we have a global health pandemic, the duty for data sharing. And I have to say, from my worldview, I'm quite pleased to see that many companies, pharmaceutical companies, are seeing that in a global health pandemic, we certainly have to have more data sharing than one might usual. You know, the pre-competitive, post-competitive barriers are breaking down, and we have some great collaborations. And this duty for profit sharing, benefit sharing is coming into existence more. And I think we need to carry on with this as well, and not just in a public health pandemic. This is something, in fact, that just to quote an evidence that I'm talking about real issues that I do discuss with these big companies. I mean, I'm quite impressed with Roche in a way. They've got a very interesting page on real world data, and they've been very upfront and have a position paper which is quite interesting. The only company I have. And they are saying real world data can be an enormously powerful source of information, providing greater understanding of medicine's disease and their progression and the impact of change in treatment standards over time. And that Roche is leveraging real world data to improve patient outcomes. This is great, but I keep, when I work with Roche, I say, be aware, people might justifiably start saying, well, maybe some of the income from developments which are profitable based or including this real world data, we need to think about having some kind of global foundation, which is perhaps helping the less advantaged people health-wise. I think these are real moral issues that are coming to us, which could be very positive for society as well. Okay, a side issue here, which flows on from the attribution of responsibility and shared responsibility with data. This is a quote, it's about AI. And maybe I'm going a bit far away from the discussion, but I do think some very interesting points are being made in this quote. I'm a great admirer of this report, AI Now. It's a very interesting report. And it's saying claims increasingly made that ethics frameworks need to move beyond individual responsibility, hold powerful industrial, governmental and military interests accountable as they design and employ AI. Of course, AI lives from data, it exists because of big data, with the expectation being that organizations create algorithms that provide the greatest possible benefit to people around the world. Organizations should furthermore not be indifferent to how the models they develop are used and by whom the models are used and how the benefits of their new analytical services are distributed. I mean, this is really quite revolutionary thinking concerning business ethics, particularly in the healthcare. I mean, wow, you know, this is really politically quite hot potatoes, and I think it's to be welcome. And it could lead to improvements globally as we look at all the disadvantages that many people still have. Okay, very few words, data social contract. You can look at the social contract between the society and the commercial bodies. And you've also got the classical, which is citizens, and the state and global citizens. I'm not going to say much anything about this, but COVID for me is the most incredible, surprising, depressing, sometimes cheerful, sometimes awful example of you know, how we stick together, of solidarity. Do we trust the state? Are the state, etc.? No details, but for me, COVID is really showing so many issues that we need to be looking at. Okay, so concluding reflections from this kind of a bit of a rambling presentation, really, but I do think I didn't want to do this presentation and just talk about informed consent and the Declaration of Helsinki, because you all know that. And it's important that we work on individual data confidentiality. Of course, it's important, but I do think it's not justifying somebody talking anymore at a meeting like this on this, because I think there's a lot of good stuff written. I think, you know, we're aware of this. So my rather rambling reflections, rather looking at what should we be doing and where are we going, and let's keep ahead of the curve, or at least with the curve. So I started off by saying the event protecting confidentiality and privacy, which was certainly why. Is data confidentiality a moribund construction? A bit of a romantic touch there, but Shakespearean. And I think yes and no. I think we need to be, of course, concerned about data confidentiality, but we've got to stop assuming that if that box is ticked, we've got no other ethical concerns with big data sets. I think that is absolutely not the case. And we need to work together to look at the issues in a positive way. And I'm not saying looking at the issues to stop research or to stop progress, but I do think we need to be aware of what's going on and take the populations with us as well, because it is their data that are often being used. Data confidentiality, one size fits all. As I mentioned at the beginning, I don't think there is ever going to be, there should not be a simplistic one size fits all data innovation, ethics and governance framework, whether it be about data confidentiality, anything. We've got to get over thinking, we can have a one size fits all, one guideline, not the way at all. That specific data confidentiality issues need to be differentiated along several axes, because this context, it varies how we should be thinking about the data, the service or product involved. I mean, I would maintain that it is a bit different if you're talking about data and it's to do with health, which is a global human right, attainable health, or if it's or if Google are looking at how often I look at Prada handbags on the internet. I mean, you've got a principle which is the same of having a right to confidentiality, but I think we shouldn't over egg that. I do think that if we're talking about a service which is to do with human rights, then it's a slightly different framework. I think it's a huge thing. The state public agency, we're looking at data, who owns it, who doesn't. We're all very much aware that almost all legislation allows for states to take public data and use when it's public health. We're all aware historically that can be a problem. Data is so political. It's so political. It's very important when we look at anything, differentiate commercial data collection and use and non-commercial. Often we have these mixtures, understanding who the stakeholders are, what the intended area of data use is going to be. And this is something I'm very disappointed most commentaries are not looking at, whether it's COVID or data generally. We have to differentiate with data use, whether it's research, where we're looking at something we don't know about, trying to find something else, whether it's medical healthcare practice, where we know something and we're using data about how this cancer drug works on the longer term. Public health research is quite a different ethical kettle of fish concerning the principles which come to the fore. Public health intervention, when you actually got a vaccine, is also a very specific kind of data. And the focus needs really to be on developing data sharing models at the moment. I think that's something I'm getting more involved in, and looking at data confidentiality, rights, duties, waivers, etc., for various contexts where we have different kinds of data. Now then, I think it's my last slide. So this is something I did quite a while ago. If you look at many documents and guidelines looking at data innovation, big data, the modern algorithms, etc., all the guidelines. Tom's on this call. I mean, he did a fantastic paper for the RSS looking at the landscape, the ethics landscape. It's enough to drive you to drink, honestly. But I spent many hours just kind of distilled down. And it is quite an interesting group of ethical principles and approaches that when you're looking at data generally, particularly in the healthcare, accountability, autonomy, awareness, data provenance, very important, dignity, don't harm, equality, explainability. This is really quite a new area of ethics needs when you're looking at big data. Fairness, human rights, justice, respect, reticence, risk, like that one, responsibility, solidarity, huge, transparency, and trust. And I can't see what's the word there. I've got my slides. What am I saying? Yeah, I think we've got to add. What am I saying? Add there. So I've got my screen is partly. What's
it
in the
says
box?
add utility. Add utility.
Add utility. Thank you. Sorry, I've got this box. I loved the description of this event. You talked about utility in data, Robin. I like that because it's a kind of. I thought, yeah, that is totally cool. And I think you're absolutely right. I think when we're looking at data sets, utility in the sense of, is it doing any good? Is it doing any good? Which, of course, is deeply involved in statistical matters about how we're using the data, how we're analysing it. That's why stats people have to be at the forefront of all big data health stuff to make sure we're using appropriate statistical methods. That I would like one-man band to add utility to these lists. And that we really need to think about how to apply these kind of groups of principles and ideas which have come out from the whole big data era to things like data confidentiality. So that is the end of my presentation. Let me see if I can get out of it. Thank you for listening, watching, and I hope discussing. Right, can I stop presenting? Can we see me now? We're here. What's happening now? Can you see me?
Yeah,
Okay.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, Nicola. I'm sure we're all giving you a round of applause, but we're all muted. So, that sort of thing is probably not as easy to do on online. So really great presentation. Lots to think about. Lots of really nice ideas. From my personal perspective, I work as a statistician, so we tend to well, I don't want to generalize, but I sometimes tend to just focus on bad aspects of a problem, and there's always other issues to do around that which we do really need to think about. So I'm really pleased you were talking about all these issues. So, and lots to think about. So as I was saying, that now is sort of a time for some questions before the next talk. Again, we're all in a slightly new format. So there's obviously the chat people are typing in, and I'll just go over to that in a bit, because there's a few comments that came through during your talk. If someone does want to speak or ask a question, if they just want to put in the chat that I'd like to say something, that's totally fine. Then we can just unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. But either way, written or verbally, I think we should be flexible in this setting. So so if you're going to ask something, if you could just put something in the chat, that would be great. But if we move to the chat, Mark actually had an interesting thought something was quite interesting, that the NHS COVID Data Store claims that the pseudo anonymized data don't identify any individual, and that's contrary to GDPR. So that's I'm not sure. So that may well be a mistake on their part, although who knows.
It's well spotted. I mean, this is actually, we're laughing, but this is disgusting. This is unbelievable, isn't it? I mean, this on the NHS COVID website, and they can't get anything. And this, isn't it depressing?
I think this is sort of this is highlighting sort of very strongly why we need to be need to be really on this. And there's another comment actually which again ties in with as we're all thinking, I suppose, on the pandemic, where you get data from the NHS Digital on consented trial patients, and that clashes between the regulatory frameworks, and so there's so much pressure, I think, on getting data that these issues can arise, I think.
I like Kerry Hood's comments. It's a shame that Kerry can't speak.
I think, Kerry can certainly speak if she would like. If as I say, we just want to be flexible. So if
happy to.
Yeah, please tell me more. I like this.
So I'm the director of the clinical trials unit. So I'm part of the network of directors in the UK, and I think we see, whereas once upon a time we would have got consent from patients to look at their medical records, would have gone into every hospital or gone into every GP practice, we're now pushed to get it from NHS Digital, which is right because it's more efficient. But then actually it comes with a completely different governance framework to what we used to have. And part of that includes the requirement, for example, to keep maintaining a license with them to hold the data. So if I do a trial in paediatrics, I am required by clinical trial regulations to hold the data until the youngest participant is 21. But that time myself into 21 years of requiring to keep updating this license with NHS Digital for permission to use the data. And at any point they could say, which they have done on some of our previous studies, we don't believe your original consent fits with our now model for consent and access. So I think there's a real clash between those two, and these are ones with consent.
Oh, I mean, my heart breaks for you, Kerry. I mean, yeah, I can't. Yeah, I just say yes. I mean, I think the only hope, the only good thing, if we're talking about, of course, obviously a pandemic, a global pandemic, then of course the consent becomes perhaps not relevant. Okay, because you've got a global health pandemic and you've got a different set of laws. But Kerry, I mean, we can talk one-to-one. Yeah, it's a mess. It's a mess. And I think what's very important, Kerry, is that people like you who are really involved on the battlefront, at the front of, well, I hate those war metaphors, sorry, at the front of healing lots of lovely people, that if you think the NHS Digital's concepts, etc., need improvement, that we really make sure that we have a nice interaction with them to help them understand the kind of knowledge that you have, that you really know, and get things changed. So don't give up, please. And if things need to be changed so that you're not in this silly position, then let's work to try and get things changed concerning the licenses.
Sorry, I had muted myself there. Sorry. So no, thank you. Yeah, this is great. Really great to have these discussions, and I really hope that follow-on discussions continue after this event as appropriate. So thank you again, Nicola. I think to keep the time, I don't see any more questions coming through on the chat. So so I suggest we move on to our next speaker, Catherine Tucker, who is going to be speaking on data privacy and secondary use of clinical trial data, challenges and opportunities. Again, a very relevant and timely topic. So, Catherine, thank you very much, and look forward to your talk.
Great. Can I just check you can see my screen?
Yeah, I can see and hear you fine. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Because once you're projecting, you can't see anything else as part of the meeting. So thanks very much, Nicola. Really fascinating talk. So a bit of a change of tack now. I have to say I'm a lot less philosophical in my talk, but maybe these are going to be quite complementary in some ways. So I'm going to focus a bit more on some of the practical and data privacy aspects of reuse, primarily secondary use of clinical trial data. I should also just say that I did work for many years as a statistician in the pharma industry on clinical trials, but more recently been much more involved with data sharing, anonymisation, and some data privacy topics. But I'm definitely not a lawyer. I don't have a legal background, but I did study data protection law as part of a postgraduate certificate last year. So bear that in mind. If you have particularly legal focused questions later, I won't necessarily be able to answer them all. So in terms of what I'm going to cover, I'll start off with a little bit of background and a little bit of context around the discussions that we've been having over the last few years at Roche. Then going to go on to talk about data privacy laws, and in particular the GDPR and how it applies to clinical trials. I'll then talk briefly about the role of anonymisation, but bearing in mind that Mark is going to be focusing on that as well, talking about the UCAN framework after the break, and then trying to sort of put some of the different aspects that I've discussed together in a kind of summary of some of the challenges, and then finally talking about a bit about how Roche are trying to approach these issues. And a lot of the things I'm going to talk about are quite new for us, and they aren't necessarily things that we're doing right now, but they're certainly the direction of travel. And then I'll conclude, and then I'll have one slide right at the end which is slightly different to the rest of the presentation, to talk a little bit very briefly about some work that we've done with the UK Anonymisation Network, which was based on the framework that Mark will then talk about. And I should just say as a disclaimer that these are my own views and aren't necessarily meant to represent Roche's views or policies. Okay, so I suppose the first thing to say, this is slightly narrower in its focus, in that I'm only really talking about clinical trial context here and not use of real world data, as Nicola talked about previously. And one of the things we've been talking a lot about in the last few years, as Nicola alluded to, is about how we can take existing data sources that we've generated from decades really within our company and use them to generate new insights for a variety of reasons, really, to have a better understanding of patient populations and diseases, validate new targets, develop new methodologies or endpoints, and various other scientific research. And a lot of this is driven as well by new technologies that have emerged, kind of the next generation whole genome sequencing, digital pathology, and things like machine learning. So a lot of this is in the context of a goal of developing more personalized medicines within Roche. But of course, kind of on the other side is, how do you balance those aims with some of the privacy, legal and ethical obligations that we have, such as changing privacy laws and also changing interpretations or emerging new interpretations of those laws in the context of trials, ethical considerations, as we've already heard, and then also some of this thinking into some guardrails for people who know almost nothing about data privacy laws. But obviously we need to have some way of being able to sort of help people translate their plans and compare them to the guardrails that we could come up with. So as many people know, the GDPR went live in May 2018. And new guidance also came out last year, which I'll talk about in a moment, from the European Data Protection Board. And I think in the past, one of the discussions we've had quite recently is kind of, well, you know, what did we used to do? We used to just take trial data and use it for things like sample size calculations years ago when I was a statistician. You know, what's really changed? I think what's really changed is now a large scale desire to really harness some of the value that may be locked up in those old data sets, particularly, as I say, being able to reevaluate things like retinal images, for example, and use technologies to be able to reassess them and maybe make different decisions about future medicines, and to derive that value that perhaps wasn't possible years ago. So just to give you a little bit of background as to some of the projects, one particular big project that I've been part of at Roche called EDIS, Enhanced Data and Insight Sharing. And it's all about trying to maximise the value of our clinical trial data now and in the future. And many of you may have heard this acronym about making data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable and reusable. And one of the things that I've been talking a lot about recently is that reusable really maybe needs 2 R's in it, which is the responsible reuse, because the FAIR acronym is it's all about, it's sort of making an assumption already that, well, we can use the data for the things we want to do, we just need to make it more organized and governed, but rather than perhaps another step, which is, well, can we do these things we want to do? So there's also some broader considerations around advancing science in the interest of patient care, and even, you know, some of the things that Nicola alluded to, benefits to society and public good, and also trust in organisations who hold and use these data. And the GDPR, one of its recitals, has quite a nice way of putting it, which is extremely kind of high level, which is that the processing of personal data should be designed to serve mankind, which I think is a great kind of guiding principle, but obviously what that actually means in reality is hard to translate, perhaps. So I thought I would go a little bit detailed now, just to talk a little bit about the GDPR. So as many of you will know, there's different data protection laws all over the world, which are organised in different ways. In the EU, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, and the focus today is primarily on that, but obviously other data privacy laws apply across other jurisdictions, and that is relevant because most pharma large phase 3 trials are often run with subjects recruited across the world. So I thought I would just give a little bit of context it's actually from the Information Commissioner's Office website, which is the UK Data Protection Authority, about what is data protection. So it's really about the fair and proper use of information about people. It's part of the fundamental right to privacy, but on a more practical level, it's about building trust between people and organisations. It's about treating people fairly and openly and striking a balance with the wider interests of society. So it very much speaks to this idea of trust between organisations and subjects who have their data collected, and a balance between what we can do, but also their rights as well. So I'm now going to just quickly have some definitions. So it's interesting what Nicola showed from the NHS website before, and Mark's comment. So personal data, as we already talked about, is data about identifiable or identified natural persons. That means people who are alive. So the GDPR actually doesn't cover people's data once they have died, although there may be some exceptions to that. I mean, we don't tend to really focus on that as a sort of part of our kind of planning, as it were. We treat all the data that we have in the same manner. Pseudonymized is labeled with a pseudonym, and some people think it means pseudo-anonymized, but it doesn't mean that. It just means that you don't have direct identifiers necessarily within the data, like names and addresses, but people are labeled with some code. And so the way to know who those records refer to is to know the link with the code. And clinical trial data is generally this status. It's organized in this way. So the statisticians and programmers within the company will not have any direct way of knowing who those patients are. Anonymized data, then, this is the definition under the GDPR. It's this phrase, taking into account all means reasonably likely to be used. Data subjects are no longer identifiable. So it's a very non-specific way of describing anonymization. It does go on to talk a little bit more, and I'll talk in a future slide about kind of how we've interpreted that at Roche and what that means. But essentially, it's also part of the end product of going through something like the UCAN framework that Mark will talk about later. And then processing is a phrase that's used, which basically means anything you can do with personal data, including just having it on your systems. It doesn't just mean analysing it, as it were. So next slide. So I thought I would briefly just talk a little bit. I'm not going to go through this in any detail. So the GDPR has a number of fundamental principles that it defines, and some of them are listed, well, all of them, sorry, are listed here. And when you process personal data, you must follow the principles, and I actually find them quite useful because they're not really written in a particularly legalistic way. You can actually think about how they apply to the things that you're doing in your context. And obviously one of them is that you must be processing the data in a lawful manner, and the way that you do that is by assigning a legal basis under which you're processing that data, and they're listed here in the little green diagram. Again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but the reason I mention it is that in March last year, the European Data Protection Board brought out some quite brief guidance, which talked about, and in particular addressed some inconsistencies between the clinical trial regulation and the GDPR. And it made some recommendations about the legal basis for various aspects of processing of data. And they divide it up into primary use and secondary use. And then within primary use, they divided that further into activities to do with assessing reliability and safety purposes, which they have said the legal basis is a legal obligation to do that work. And then research activities, which would be more assessing the efficacy of a new drug, for example. And they make some recommendations about the legal basis there. I'm not going to go through those in any detail, but please take a look at the guidance if you want to know more. And then for secondary use, they make some recommendations. For example, and I'll talk more in a moment about this, but one is if you can assess that the work that you're doing is compatible use compared to the original purpose for doing the trial. Another is a scientific research exemption. And then the third is if you anonymize the data. And one of the things they did say is more guidance would be coming on this subject due to its horizontal and complex nature. So more guidance hasn't come as yet, but we've used that guidance within Roche to develop our own thinking and our global data privacy group in particular. And then some of the things that we've developed are based on that. And one of the other things they clarify is, of course, everyone familiar with clinical trials will know that you always have an informed consent process as part of patients signing on to be part of a trial. And they clarify that that consent process is not the same thing as consent as a legal basis. I won't go into that more, but if you want to know more, I can try and explain it in the Q&A if you're interested. But it explains why and the kind of rationale for that. So when we process data, personal data, it comes with a number of obligations. Again, I won't go through these, but you can see from the diagram some of the things that you must do. For example, data subject rights. People have the right to be able to contact us and get a copy of their data, not necessarily to have the data deleted because of the legal obligation for us to keep the data for 25 years. And then the last thing I thought I would just add is some of my colleagues in our legal functions recently published a paper a few months ago on this subject of scientific data-driven research with some pragmatic proposals, obviously talking about the GDPR and the guidance that came out as well. So it might be worth, if you want to know more, have a look at that. Okay, so the role of anonymisation. One of the things that's quite challenging about this topic is obviously we have different data privacy laws across the world. So that there's never going to be one sort of single, simple, aligned definition because the underlying laws are not necessarily the same. I mean, they can be argued, some of them, that they are equivalent, but there's no single definition, terminology, or interpretation. So I'll focus again on the GDPR. Recital 26 addresses this, but not in a lot of detail. And I mentioned that it's this definition about all means reasonably likely to be used. So, but what does that actually mean? So they have some subclauses that talk about that you should take into account objective factors, such as the costs and the amount of time required for identification, taking into consideration the available technology at the time. And also, this isn't part of the GDPR, but a court case prior to the GDPR called the Breyer case, which was heard in the Court of Justice of the EU, established a legal point to do with whether particular companies or legal means to identify patients, and it's nothing to do with clinical trial or medical data. It was to do with IP addresses, but that can be used as part of a kind of argument. And I suppose the overall point of mentioning this, why are we talking about anonymisation? It's because if you can demonstrate that your data are anonymised, then it falls outside of the scope of the GDPR. And so those obligations that I mentioned earlier aren't necessarily in scope anymore for that processing. So not to go into any detail, but just to mention although I said at the beginning, it's quite challenging to know, well, how do you define these things? There are some really good frameworks out there. I mean, I've put on here the HIPAA privacy law in the US, which is more of a sectoral role, sectoral law or regulation to do with transfer of medical insurance information. But it talks about expert determination rule, which is a sort of risk-based approach. There's some really good publications from Privacy Analytics and from Khaled El-Amam and UCAN framework, as Mark is going to talk about later. So I think in terms of what these methodologies have in common, they really speak to a context-dependent process rather than focusing primarily on the data and what it contains and obfuscating those data, but kind of in isolation. They really start to talk about the context of how the data will be shared, the governance, the contractual controls, who the data will be shared with and why, who are they, and then trying to kind of estimate if the probability of an attack on the data and then a probability of a successful attack. But anyway, we'll hear more about that in a moment after the break. So putting it all together. So our overall aim is the use of clinical trial data for internal secondary reuse purposes. So we're not talking about here sharing outside of the company. We're trying to think about the different ways in which we can lawfully and ethically reuse clinical trial data that Roche has generated for new purposes outside of the original trial objectives. So as you've already heard from the slide where I talked about the new guidance that came out last year, there's basically two solutions. One is to reuse the original data that we collected, and I'll talk about some of the things then you need to think about. And the second is to create and use anonymized data, and I'll also talk about, the things to think about there too. So if we focus first on the use of personal data, one key thing that people need to think about is what's the purpose of the reuse. That may sound completely obvious, but quite often I have a lot of discussions with people in Roche where they're very focused on other aspects of the data, the access, the where that work's going to happen, publications, whatever it may be, rather than what's the actual objective of what you're doing and how does it relate to the original trial under which those data were generated. I think secondly, I'll maybe just click on to this. So we've done a lot of work over the last year trying to define what we mean by primary and secondary use and trying to fit it in with that advice about legal basis. So what we've ended up doing is sort of having these 4 different concentric circles, some of which are kind of no-brainers, if you want to call it that. So using the original data for the objectives of the trial, no one needs to really have a pause and think, am I allowed to do this work? Because of course you can. That's literally the whole point of running the trial. And similarly for the orange circle, related regulatory activities such as submission of data to health authorities and related publications or health technology assessments. These are all things that are part and parcel of analysing of a trial. We then get to the kind of new part, which relates to this compatible use that I mentioned in the GDPR. And we've done quite a lot of work trying to sort of define what do we mean, what does that mean, or how can we define that for clinical trial context? And in particular, thinking about sort of aspects like what would a patient expect? and if we were doing X, Y, and Z, what might their reaction be? Now, it's obviously very hard to know that, but it is, I think, deep down, people know when things are way outside of an expectation versus something that is very closely related to the original trial, but not part of the original trial objectives. And then on the outside, secondary reuse. So these are things really outside of the original trial that you can't argue are compatible. So, and then with each of these, we sort of try and match it to a legal basis. We also have, I mentioned that consent, the ICF, the informed consent form, is that separate thing to consent under GDPR, but nevertheless, that doesn't mean it's not important, because that is your route by which you have communicated to patients what will happen to their data. And so it's really important that you also use their data in line with that language. And so, you know, we've over the years, the particular standard language used within those informed consent forms has changed quite considerably. So that's another part of the puzzle, if you like. And then another thing that's quite challenging, as I just alluded to, is how do you actually match and compare your planned reuse with the protocol objectives and the ICF language? It's actually not that easy to do. And also, who decides? In a large organization where we want to have flowing data and availability to the right people to do the right things, how do we put in mechanisms such that people can get help to work through these discussions, but ultimately it isn't some kind of bottleneck? So then, to talk more on the sort of second option, which is to create and use anonymized data. So one of the things we need to figure out is, well, what does means reasonably likely mean in an internal context? It's quite easy sometimes, I think, when you're talking about publication of data in the outside world, to think about possible adversaries and what their motivations and knowledge might be. But when you're talking about internal employees, the risks are lower, but you've really got to think about, well, what could happen? And is it actually realistic? And are the risks real? Or actually, are we hopefully in a much more controllable environment, system-wise and people-wise, because they are all employees of Roche? Different approaches, estimating risk of re-identification in a qualitative versus a quantitative manner, and also in terms of data changes. When we started in our data sharing group, our focus was primarily on the clinical data. But now, when I'm sure this is true of all other pharma companies, when you run a clinical trial, you will have modalities generated across all different types. So you'll have genomic data, you'll have images, you'll have sensor data, you'll have microbiome data in some circumstances. So what does anonymization mean in those scenarios? What does anonymization mean for an image, and what kind of image? So and also balancing the privacy aspects versus utility, which I think was the last extra thing on Nicola's slide about utility. Because ultimately, if you do so much to the data that it's super, super safe, but it's useless, then you have failed in your anonymization approach. So another phrase that is used in the GDPR are so-called TOMs, technical and organizational measures. And these are, aside from the data themselves, these are all the other things you can use to protect data. So system access, metadata driven access rules kind of thing, codes of conduct, training, having physical separation of personal and anonymized data, and many, many other things. Some of them have slipped my mind, but I can probably remember them later if people have questions. And then I mentioned about all the different modalities. So linking them in the sense that if we're doing something, say, to hash or scramble an identifier in the clinical data, we need to be able to do the same thing to the image. If you do them differently and then you don't know what image links to which record, that's not going to be very helpful. And then what are the limits once you've anonymized? What are the limits of the use of that data? You know, scientific research is the sort of frame which we're thinking about at Roche, but sometimes people say, well, can I use it for testing an IT system? So common to both solutions. So I mentioned patients across multiple countries are recruited, not just in the EU. So what does that mean in terms of these definitions? I mentioned, you know, processes and infrastructure and systems are all things that need to be worked through. I haven't mentioned so much, but data citizenship and culture is another important thing. It's something we've been working on for quite a few years at Roche and trying to communicate these kind of privacy or ethical issues. I know when I worked as a statistician years ago, I would you know, as someone, I think Robin, you might have said, you know, you just work on the data. You're just thinking about, you're not thinking about it in terms of people. You're thinking about it in terms of data and results and analytics and statistical analysis plan. So I think the awareness of these concepts, training and knowledge is really important. And the last thing is, we've constructed all these lovely ways of thinking about it, but of course, some of this external guidance may change, and then we will need to update and adapt. So just to finish, and then some conclusions, and then a little kind of bit about the work we've done with UCAN. So we had a workshop about a year ago talking about internal secondary reuse of trial data, and in particular trying to translate these legal requirements into something scalable for the business, as I mentioned. The way we've ended up tackling it is with things like a philosophy statement, a set of principles, and some business recommendations. I think people sometimes want very black and white process information, but unfortunately, as you've probably heard, you know, these things are not black and white, and they often require quite a lot of nuanced discussion. So one of the things we also did, I mean, this is not a real flow diagram, but we created a decision-making flow diagram to help people work through some of the primary sort of compatible use, secondary use of anonymized data, that kind of a way of thinking. We've also been doing a lot of work with our global data privacy colleagues about how we define anonymization for internal reuse. Finally, the EDIS project that I mentioned is adopting many of these kind of concepts, and in particular, when we make data available for secondary use to lots of different data users for lots of different uses, it should always be based on anonymized data. And then finally, data citizenship program that we've been running for a while. So in conclusion, responsible data reuse is key in advancing science, and really doing this in the interest of patients, not least to maintain their trust. The purpose of secondary use is the key way to think about what you can and can't do. And personal data generated from trials can be used for compatible or scientific research purposes, but it does need careful consideration. Use of anonymized data for secondary use, where possible, has advantages, and it is actually encouraged as part of that recital that I mentioned, I think, in the GDPR. And it may also allow a broader scope of scientific research purposes. And it is a changing privacy landscape, maybe not necessarily in terms of the laws, but in the interpretation of those laws. And there's likely to be new guidance coming, which will mean those plans will need to evolve. Overall, some of these topics, as you can hear, are quite complex, and I think it does need a cross-functional approach and good connections between data privacy, legal, IT, and then us in the business and data scientists, ideally as part of a comprehensive information and data governance strategy. So that's the end of my main presentation. I've got one more slide just to talk about the work that we've done with the UK Anonymisation Network, which you will hear more about from Mark after the break. So this relates to something different to what I was just talking about. This relates to a requirement from the European Medicines Agency, and also now Health Canada, to make clinical documents, such as clinical study reports, available really for open publication on their website. Anyone, a member of the public, can access. I think you have to be an EU citizen for the EMA one. Anyone can download and have a look, or maybe not download, they can view or possibly download documents. And so if we're going to make those available in the public domain, they need to be anonymized in a way that is appropriate for that context of publication, without really very little control. So we did a couple of pieces of work with UCAN a couple of years ago now, using their framework. The first is called a data situation audit, and it looked at this context of sharing via the EMA platform, sharing of clinical study reports. And then the second piece of work was about classifying the risk associated with CSRs, as we call them, and in particular, looking at what sections and particular pieces of information that are commonly within CSRs kind of represent the highest level of risk, if you like. And in particular, we've also then subsequently done quite a lot of work thinking about patient narratives, which are within those documents, which are particularly rich in very specific subject-related data, which could be identifying. So I will finish there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Again, I'm sure there's much virtual clapping going on behind the muted speakers. Really interesting talk. Really, really nice. I mean, one thing that resonated with me just was the was what we mean by data again. Just because when your point about images, because you know, again, in my world that I've been working in, primarily data as sort of numbers and tables or something like that, and obviously we have methods to address or deal with those, or at least ongoing research. But things like images, how do you anonymize an image? What does that even mean? So that's something which I think you know, I've sort of something that's just piqued my interest just now. So but yeah, no, I'm sure that's going to be great. Some really nice discussion points following on from this. I'll just go to the chat because there has been some discussion going on there.
Okay.
So firstly, Kerry has shared a link to online training for working with administrative data. So thank you very much for sharing that. And Robert has actually raised a really interesting point that I'm sort of itching to discuss, because the thing is that I think that's going to be quite good as a panel discussion topic. So just to let you know what the question was, it was the fact that GDPR only applies to living people. It does seem a bit harsh, but it doesn't apply to dead people. But that's what the rule is. But even if it did, Robert says genetic data, for example, tells you something about relatives. So you know, maybe probabilistically, and so what do we do about that? I think Nicola and Mark has actually commented on that as well. I'm sure to have comments as well. Maybe if you just want to briefly respond to that, but I'd certainly like to discuss that more in the panel discussion as well, because I think Mark and Nicola would like to say more there too, maybe. But I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, on a very practical level, I don't think it really makes much difference to us at Roche, as in we don't really do anything differently. Whether data, I mean, obviously, when you run an oncology trial, a lot of those patients will have passed away by the end of that trial or in the follow-up, but we don't do anything differently based on that fact, if you see what I mean. But I think on the broader point of genetic data, I think that's a really good point that I hadn't even thought of. So yeah, maybe we can address that more in the panel.
Yeah, but I think if that's okay with Nicola and
yeah, that's fine. So it's a very good point. There's a lot of thought about this, and thank you very much, Robert, for raising it. Great.
So we'll definitely come back to that, because I think that's worthy of more than just a couple of minutes, really, because I think that's going to be really interesting to discuss. And there is another question from Khaled, who has asked, are these analyses with the UK anonymisation network available as publication or reports?
They're not published at the moment. Maybe I can get Mark to comment, or if he wants to comment in his presentation as well. But no, we haven't had any discussions yet about publications with UCAN.
Okay, great. I don't see that there are any more questions coming through. If anyone does want to ask a question, if they just want to either just unmute themselves and ask right now, I don't think that'll be an issue at the moment, or just type something in the chat. But I think we're okay for the moment. Obviously, we do have a panel discussion taking place at the end, where certainly we'll have already one really interesting question. And if people do have other questions, please don't be shy to ask them. We'll be, it'd be really great to get a good discussion going at the end of the session. So what I'm going to suggest is, Catherine has nicely led on to Mark's talk on the UK anonymisation network, but let's have a bit of a break, as we would normally do in a usual scientific meeting. So unfortunately, we can't be meeting in person, otherwise there would have been refreshments. But of course, this is impossible in a virtual meeting. But if everyone wants to get their own refreshments, and then feel free to use the chat to have discussions as well. That's what it's there for. But what I'll suggest that we do is reconvene in half an hour, so at 10 to 4:50, and then Mark will present, and then we'll have a panel discussion to finish things off. So if we reconvene in half an hour, 10 to 5, that would be great. So see you all soon. Welcome back, everybody. So I can see there's some nice chat going on in the Teams, and I think there might well be relevant points to discuss in the panel discussion as well, actually, because we're trying to keep it all encompassing. We don't want to limit ourselves, and I think we've got, there's the first two talks are showing, as well as I'm sure the third one will. There's a lot to think about, and we're trying to cover as much as possible of this topic, as ever we can ever cover the whole topic. So I guess let's move on to our third and final talk of the meeting, by Mark Elliott, and he will be presenting his presentation title is the Revised Anonymisation Decision-Making Framework. Thank you, Mark. Great. Can see your slides.
Okay, hello. So yes, as introduced, I am Mark Elliott from University of Manchester, and I lead, as Catherine has nicely introduced, the UK Anonymisation Network, which is responsible for the anonymisation decision-making framework, which I will be talking about today, and in particular the new version of the anonymisation decision-making framework, which we are hoping to publish this week. It might be spilling over into next week. I'll talk about that at the end. Okay, so I'll give you a quick introduction to UCAN, UK Anonymisation Network, and then there'll be a little skit on what is anonymisation, an overview of the framework, and then specifically introducing the important concept of data flows. So I suppose I'm something of a bridge. It's not as much philosophy as Nicola, and it's not quite as nuts and bolts as Catherine. There's some sort of material that falls into both categories. What is anonymisation is a somewhat more theoretical discussion, and then the framework is a practical tool. So first, this is UCAN. I'm not going to spend ages talking about who we are. It's just to give you a basic introduction. So it's a consortium of 4 organisations over on the right of this slide. This is the front page of our website. And we provide support and guidance for people, organisations, groups, centres, etc., who need to anonymise data in order to share it or process it in some other way. So this concept of anonymisation, what is it? So terminology is quite complex in this area. And Nicola alluded to that earlier on, and I shall be repeating her point with a graphic in a moment. So I'm going to talk about anonymisation and other concepts and particular perspectives on anonymisation, and then go through to introduce functional anonymisation, which is the underpinning concept which the ADF and UCAN use in all of its processes and decision making, and indeed all of our advice. And in specific, one area which is really important, which Catherine alluded to, the notion of context, or what we call data environments, is being absolutely critical in thinking about anonymization and data processing, and therefore data protection. Okay, so I would normally say exercise for people at this point, but since we're not having a very, it's not that sort of meet, I'll move on and I'll answer this question. And so privacy, as Nicola introduced earlier on, privacy is about people, but privacy is about personhood. Privacy is about a wide range of topics, not just to do with data. And it's not primarily about information. Okay? So you may have privacy concerns about information, but information is just digital stuff. It requires no privacy, but we do as people. So it gets mixed up with this other term, confidentiality. And confidentiality is solely and completely about information and data. Essentially, confidentiality is a boundary condition around data. It's a boundary which is maintained either by security, information security, infrastructure of that sort, or by an agreement, or by laws, or by rules, or by social norms. So when I say to you, I'm telling you this in confidence, what I'm doing is casting a boundary around the two of us and getting your agreement not to pass that information on to a third party. And the same applies to the duty of confidence that a doctor has with their patients. And we all can also apply this to a security system, whether it's an IT system or a physical one, in order to keep data within a certain boundary. Okay, so that's what confidentiality is about. And a lot of people talk about privacy when in fact what they mean is confidentiality. And there's a particular concept in the technical domain called differential privacy, which is completely misnamed because differential privacy is nothing to do with privacy. In fact, it's everything to do with confidentiality. So anonymization in this concept is a set of processes for maintaining confidentiality. And they may have some benefits for privacy, but they are not its primary goal. And then there's this other term which often gets confused with anonymization, which is statistical disclosure control. And a lot of data-focused discussions which get labeled as anonymization are in fact talking about statistical disclosure control. And differential privacy is another concept which falls within this. I could have another bouncing ball with DP on it. So we can talk reasonably about confidentiality risk, and following Nicola, I'm now focusing on confidentiality pretty much for the rest of the talk and putting privacy to one side. Now, there's two key points here which get muddled up. When we're talking about risk in most domains, certainly most mature domains, we think about likelihood and we also think about. So it's not simply the probability of an event happening, it's also the impact. Another issue that comes up, which is very peculiar to the confidentiality and privacy domain, is a confusion of could with will. So whereas in a mature risk industry, for example, the airline industry, they're not concerned primarily with could. Could this plane crash is always true. Yes, the plane could crash. Will the plane crash is the question they're interested in. And these are obviously very different questions. So I'll illustrate this with a slightly odd example. So could I, when I go for my walk, for my exercise, after I finish talking to you, be hit by a meteor? Yes, I could. Will I be hit by a meteor? Well, it's extremely unlikely. So much so that if I concern myself with whether I get hit by a meteor or not, I might well suffer another risk, which is being hit by a car. So could I be hit by a car? Yes. Will I be hit by a car? Well, if I'm not careful about it. So this last risk is a risk that I'm going to control and have some autonomy over in terms of my own decision making. The first risk, I'm actually going to pay no attention to whatsoever. This is an important point, which I'll come back to later. This has often come, this kind of issue has come from the fact that a lot of the discussion about this came from statisticians in the 1990s and early 2000s. So they tended to focus on problems that were amenable to statistical treatment. This is an equation that was developed by Marsh et al. 1991, so it's a 30-year-old piece of work now. It's very simple. It's saying the probability of identification is equal to the probability of an attempt multiplied by the probability of an identification given an attempt. And actually, that's just true by definition. Now, the actual point here is that the last part of this equation is relatively amenable to statistical treatment, the probability of an identification given that an attempt has happened. The first element of the right-hand side, the probability of an attempt, is something which is really difficult to define. And so it's tended to be treated as if it's unity, it's exactly one. The probability of an attempt is always one, regardless of circumstances. And this has led to some very muddled thinking. So the other element of the problem is that because the impact of privacy risk or confidentiality risk is quite difficult to define, the tendency is to treat a privacy breach as if it's apocalyptic. It's equivalent to a nuclear power station blowing up. And that is clearly nonsensical. And again, this has led to some very muddled thinking. So there's a tendency to treat the likelihood of an event happening which carries some risk as one. And there's a tendency to treat the impact as if it's infinity. And then to concentrate on that bridging concept of the likelihood of an effect given an attempt. Now, what we proposed early on when we were sort of faced with this array of very interesting and complicated, sophisticated, but nevertheless muddled technical literature was a more sophisticated approach in the top level of thinking about precursors. What is it that needs to happen in order for this event that you're concerned about to actually happen? And what are the consequences of that? What happens next? One of the things that is unfortunate about this very narrow approach that I was just characterizing is that the responsibility for consequences seems to be kicked down the road. So actually, one of the things you can do to reduce risk is to have in place appropriate breach policies and appropriate strategies for dealing with the events if they happen, because then you're managing the impact, which is an important element of the risk. So what is anonymization in this context? So anonymization is a process by which personal data are rendered non-personal. I've just got a echo there. Oh, it's gone now. Okay. Personal data are rendered non-personal. So this is tying a technical definition of anonymization into the legal construct of personal data. And what we mean by that is we make it very hard to identify someone. Now, anonymization is not a state of the data. What we mean by that is we have to be very careful when we're using success terms such as anonymized. This tends to lead people into all sorts of erroneous thinking. Anonymized, what exactly does that mean? Is this just some description of the data? As we'll come on to later, it's actually, if it is, it's impossible. One of the things you notice is that people use this term, or perhaps fully anonymized, and you kind of want to think, well, isn't that just anonymized? And what's happening here is that people are going down a rabbit hole of, I don't mean what you're meaning, I'm meaning this other thing, which I'm not quite sure what it means, but it's a bit more than what you're talking about. And then you actually know you're in trouble when somebody says this, which I heard a few years ago in a conversation, and you really know you are going down that terrible rabbit hole, really, truly anonymized. So we do use the term anonymized, but what we mean by it is reinforced in the sense of reinforced concrete. So an anonymized data is reinforced data. And we don't expect reinforced concrete to withstand, for example, being hit by a meteor, but we do expect it to stand up to the everyday wear and tear that the buildings that we're constructing out of it are going to have to deal with. We expect it to do its job. So here's some perspectives on anonymisation, which again just throw into perspective the different ways people talk about it, and some of which are very misleading and unhelpful. So formal anonymisation, which includes pseudonymization and what's also called de-identification in a European context, although not in a US context. Formal anonymisation is the removal or masking of identifiers, and it's very rarely sufficient. That's the key thing. And it is often what is put up as a straw person by people who want to attack anonymisation. This is not what we mean. Absolute anonymisation, on the other hand, is another straw person that's put up by people who want to attack anonymisation, the likes of Ohm and Dwork. And essentially what they're saying is that actually this is an impossible standard, and we agree. The notion that there's zero possibility of re-identification under any circumstances for a given set of data, you can mathematically demonstrate that that is not the case. Any piece of data can be attacked if you have sufficient resources. So even a simple population count could be, in the literal definition, count as personal data if you apply this standard. And that is clearly nonsense and not what is meant. So statistical anonymisation is essentially statistical disclosure control. And this is an improvement on these other two, because here we're into the realm of risk. And the thing to understand is anonymisation is a risk management process. It's a method for reducing risk of re-identification. It's not an absolute standard. So I say this, I used to say new, and now it says newish standard, newish insight, because it dates back over 10 years. So our statement is that the risk lies in the relationship between the data and their environment. There is no risk in the data themselves because they're just digital stuff. At the very least, you need a human to interpret what the data mean before any risk actually arises. So the relationship between the data and their environment, and we'll come on to what that term means in a moment, was invented by Mackie, my co-author and colleague at University of Manchester, who the data environment perspective. And this led to a process known as data environment analysis, which we developed for the 2011 census, and was finally formalized in an approach called functional anonymisation, for which the most recent position paper on that was published in 2018. This is the formal definition from a 2014 paper. And I'm not going to go through this because I'm going to go into some detail in a moment, but just to know that that is there. So this is what we mean when we talk about data environments. Now, data environments consist of these four things always. We haven't found a situation at the moment. We're always open to changing or updating this, where these four parameters do not completely describe the environment. And they are other data, agents, usually people, could be AI systems these days, security infrastructure, and governance processes. Those four things completely describe environments. Those of you who are familiar with the 5 safes might notice some similarities with that construct. It's not the same as the 5 safes. The 5 safes is a very particular standard mechanism for dealing with secure environments. What we do here is much more dynamic. Principles underpinning functional anonymisation. So we got 5 principles, and they really come from the foregoing discussion. Comprehensive principle: you cannot decide whether data are safe to share or not by examining the data alone, but you do need to look at the data. So you need to consider data and their environment. Utility principle, which Nicola referred to, I think, in her responses to some of the questions. Anonymisation is a process to produce safe data, but it only makes sense if what you are producing is safe, useful data. Okay? That is important. We say if you're not producing useful data, then you shouldn't be doing this at all, because then whatever residual risk that you're leaving, and there will always be residual risk, is for no benefit. So there must be some benefit. Realistic risk principle, zero risk is infeasible if you're to produce useful data. Proportionality principle, the measures you put in place to manage disclosure risk should be proportional to the likelihood and the likely impact of that risk. So just digging a bit deeper into this notion of the comprehensiveness principle. So anonymization is not about the data. It's very difficult to get your head around if you've been working with that statistical disclosure control approach to thinking about what anonymization is. Anonymization is about data situations which arise from data interacting with environments. That is where the risk lies. Without that interaction, there is no risk. It's just digital stuff sitting in a black box. So far I've described anonymization as a process, not a state, and I've introduced our notion of anonymization, functional anonymization, which states that the risk lies between data and their environment, and described this thing called the data situation. So now I'm going to go into an overview of the anonymization decision-making framework, which builds on this concept. So what's the key question that you've got to address if you're handling data and thinking about your responsibilities? And this applies beyond the notion of anonymization. It's a general concept about thinking about managing risk to data and data protection. Understanding how a confidentiality breach might occur, exactly what is it that might happen to lead to a confidentiality breach with your data. Understand the possible consequences of that breach. Those are those precursors and consequences of an event which you will precisely and completely describe. And then what you need to do is you need to reduce the risk of that event happening down to a negligible level. Now, this notion of negligibility is quite important, and it's an agreed term with the Information Commissioner's Office, who we work with very closely. What does negligibility mean? Now, we've got a common sense definition. A negligible risk is a risk that a reasonable person will ignore. A risk that a reasonable person will ignore. So in the example I gave earlier, I am going to completely ignore the present but very, very tiny risk of being hit by a meteor for the rest of my life. I am not going to ignore the risk of being hit by a car because I will be dead fairly soon if I do that. So that's the key point. It actually makes sense to us intuitively. We don't usually think about it in terms of data. But essentially, we are endeavoring to reduce the risk to a very small level. Now, this is a very complex thing once you get into the practice of it, but having that in mind is that there's an important point here. It is actually relatively easy to reduce the risk from high or moderate down to negligible. It's very, very hard to reduce it from negligible to zero. And you can actually only do that by effectively ending up with random data. So essentially, the process here is about one of understanding your responsibilities and then understanding what exactly the risks are. What events is it you're concerned about happening? And how then do we assess the risk of those events? And therefore, how do we stop them? So what's the ADF? It's a tool for delivering these responsibilities, particularly for developing anonymization policy, for understanding your own data situation, and then managing confidentiality risk, both likelihood and impact. It is not a checklist, it's a tool for thinking, and it is also a book. So how was it created? Well, it was a 4-year process that ran from 2012 to 2016. We had a series of multi-stakeholder workshops from all sectors, all disciplines, legal, statistical, computational, psychologists, criminologists, all sorts of people were involved in thinking about this process. Each of these workshops was given one question to answer. What is anonymization? Which turns out to be a bit of a koan if you're a follower of Japanese culture. It's like an impossible question, but in the process of answering the question, you draw out a lot of important issues. And what that told us was this was not a single dimensional thing. It involved ethics, it involved legal analysis, it involved technical issues to do with computation and statistics. The collation of the thinking was drawn into a book, which is published and available free on our website. Drafts of this book were reviewed by an international cross-sectoral panel of reviewers. We had 35 reviewers, again, from all sectors and across the world. So it was much more heavily reviewed than a standardly published book, even though it is self-published as open access. We had hundreds of comments, went through a series of revisions and further reviews, and the book was eventually published in 2016. An Australian version was published in the autumn of 2017. It's actually called the De-Identification Decision-Making Framework because of difference in terminology. A second edition, a review of the book took place in 2018 and 2019, funded by the Higher Education Funding. It was one of the funded before they changed to Research England. It was input from our 3 advisory groups, which we set up. We have a user community group, a legal group, and a scientific expert group, who all reviewed the book and came back with additional feedback. We are also taking into account changes for GDPR, which was obviously implemented in 2018, and indeed national legislation in the UK context, and indeed further conceptual development over the course of that period. There are new materials. There's a compact version, practitioner facing, which is what will be hopefully published this week, and a set of short summary documents to put under your manager's nose, and indeed a document for particularly focusing on legal issues. So what has changed? The component structure, for those of you who have seen the old ADF, the new one has a completely different component structure, which I'll be introducing in a moment. Some of the components have been merged, some of them have been split, and there's some new components. There's new content. We've got refined, developed ideas around what it means to focus on a particular environment, the notion of steps and streams in data flows. And the key point is that data flows and provenance are now central. So data provenance, which isn't normally a concept that people think about in combination with anonymization, is actually vital. And it ties in with a number of other issues such as consent. Legal materials now a parallel structure mapped onto all components rather than a single standalone component. There are a number of companion documents, and we have tools and templates built in. So this is the new 10-step process. I'm going to go through each of the parts in Basel. I won't dwell too long on this slide. So Catherine mentioned this in her talk, the data situation audit. This is one of the things we offer as a service. If you want to commission a service from us, this is usually the starting point, a data situation audit. And essentially it breaks down now into a series of steps where we go through from your presenting problem. What is it? You come to us. Very often organizations come to us and they say something along the lines of, we've got these data and we want to do X with it. Can you help us do that? Or we've got these data and our minister is telling us that we have to make them open. How can we decide if that's possible? Or we've got these data and this other organization wants to share them. Can we do that? So those are the presenting problems. And what we need to do almost invariably is think about data flows. And that's why they've become central. We map the data flows, we map all the different environments, what they're constituted out of. And we describe and map the data as it flows through those environments. And these can get very complex. There's invariably some engagement with stakeholders, whether it's done by us or by the organizations themselves. And it's a really important element of managing risk. Again, not usually thought of as key to this part, but it's actually really, really important. Stakeholder management is a really important part of risk management. And then finally, there we have the process now, a formal process, built into the system where you evaluate the data situation, which gives you summary risk and what we call data situation sensitivity, which then allows you to make decisions about what you need to do at your next steps. So this is the technical processes. Now, this is and eventually this is the step that normally gets called anonymization in a lot of different conversations. is actually disclosure control. So it involves assessing risk and then controlling that risk using technical processes and procedural processes and governance processes. So what are the risks? How do I control them? And finally, impact management. So impact is important in determining your risk level. It's part of what we mean by risk. If you had zero impact, you will be risking nothing. And so if you can, therefore, it implies that if you control the impact, you reduce the risk. And you can do that in a variety of different ways. You can carry on building and maintaining your relationship with your stakeholders, issues like transparency. If your stakeholders know what you're doing and an unfortunate thing happens, even though with your best attempts you've tried to prevent it, then the impact is going to be smaller and therefore the risk is smaller. Plan what you do if things go wrong, have in place breach policies, and then monitor the evolving data situation. We very much recommend against release and forget. Once you've done something, then continue to keep your eyes on it and the broader data situation, which is going to affect your overall risk. So I'm just going to go into data flows because I've flagged that these are really important, and then I'll close. So what is a data situation? I'll give an example of data flows. Think about data provenance and understanding what we mean by data environments. So when we think about presenting problems, this firstly is the presenting problem static or dynamic. We do have organizations come to us and just say, we've got these data, we're storing them here. Is that okay? So that's a static data situation. The vast majority of data situations that are of concern to an anonymizer are dynamic. They're about data moving around. And once you start thinking about that, then you start thinking about, okay, is this just a single step or is this a multi-step transfer? They often are. Is this a single stream or are there multiple streams? There often are multiple streams. So, and then you need to know what is or are the data environments in that data flow, and how does the data in question relate to each of those environments? And which environments and steps, streams are you responsible for? And that's a really important point, because who are you is one of the questions we ask in the new book. Who are you and why are you even engaging with this? So what's your responsibility here? And clarifying that is often a concern of people that come for advice from us, because they're in the middle of a quite complicated data situation, and what bits of it are they actually responsible for? Can they control? And what parts do they have some secondary responsibility for? So here's a very simple data situation. It's a simple data share. Organization 1 collects personal data and stores it, and then shares some version of that data with organization 2, who wants to use it for a secondary purpose. Situations are very rarely as simple as this. We have had one or two occasional consultations around this type of thing. Here's a slightly more common one. Organization X is collecting some data. There's a local authority, perhaps there's a legal requirement for organization X to pass this data under some data sharing agreement. I've anonymized subset, remember we mean reinforced here, not just some absolute standard. And then as part of their legal process, there's a requirement for the LA, perhaps for a transparency or perhaps for some monitoring process to release aggregate data into the open data environment. Now, the open data environment is an environment, okay? It has all the properties that we discussed earlier on. It's a lot simpler to work out some of them, and there's a lot more responsibility for thinking about what data the data structures are than there are with more secure environments. Now, Catherine mentioned the data situation audit that we did for Roche, and this was the top level data flow that we produced out of here. And as you can see, this is now starting to get quite a bit more complicated. One of the things that we should mention is that there's an issue of granularity, something we talk about in the book. So, for example, inside in many of these boxes are themselves data flows. So that when the data comes into Roche, it goes through a whole set of processes of different environments and teams before the outputs get produced. I'm not going to go into the details of this. It's really just to demonstrate the complexity that these environmental flows can get to, thinking about how the data moves through those and the status and the transfer arrangements and so on. This is our formalism for visualizing data environments. This is a description of a secure lab. And again, we're pulling out those 4 different elements and thinking about the relationship between those and the data. And this is just one way of describing it. We have other mechanisms for capturing the key elements through a formalism and a scoring mechanism. But being able to visualize these into different structures of this sort is really important in terms of getting our understanding represented so that we can have a common language for talking about this with people that we're working with. Okay, just some concluding remarks as I'm aware that I'm running out of time. So the anonymization decision-making framework is a tool which allows you to think constructively about your data situation. It moves us closer to a harmonized idea of anonymization. Okay, so we've done a lot of work across that technical legal interface and also thinking about the relationship between technical processes and ethical understandings. So the harmonization here is between those different perspectives on anonymization. And that's why we had all of those people round the table when we were doing the initial work. It's in use all over the world. It's been adopted in situ for a number of organizations. Other organizations have taken parts of it and incorporated it into their own local policies. It's available on a Creative Commons license, so people are free to do that. The second edition will be released this week, and an open access book will be available from our website. We have done a short print run of hard copies, and there will be a mechanism available to request a, again, free hard copy if you're so inclined. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. Again, I'm sure much virtual clapping going on. A really interesting talk as ever. I mean, lots to think about there. I really like the specific, from my point of view, the issue of a data situation, because obviously when I work in sort of mathematics or statistics, and you can develop some general sort of methodology, but then the data situation is so key and sort of governs really so much about the problem. So it was really great to see some discussion about that. Thank you. We have some discussions going on the chat, and I think some of them again are going to be quite relevant for the panel discussion, but I'll just bring these in onto the chat. So I think Tom had a question about the anonymization process because it makes an assumption that it seems to make an assumption that it can't be entirely reversed, and so he's asking, are systematic re-identification techniques unrealistic?
Do you want me to take that question?
I'm assuming it was asked at it was asked during your talk. So I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Certainly, absolutely. Yeah. Okay, so if you view, so this is a point in essentially that Ohm makes in his 2010 paper, where he essentially attacks anonymization. And this is the absolute standard that I was mentioning earlier on. So if you mean literal non-reversibility, then no, there is no technique that you can employ which will reduce the risk to zero. Okay, so now if you're talking about disclosure control processes, then we can analyze that specifically. But you have to make it clear that you understand that what you mean if you take that position is that you cannot publish any data, full stop. Even a population count will be re-identifiable by your literal definition. So I can demonstrate this if I have a data set, and this is the type of thing that mathematicians do when they want to prove that anonymization does not work. So I have a data set which includes everyone in the population bar 1. Okay, so you've released a population count. I now subtract my units from your population count. I end up with a single person, and I go, aha! Now we now have a single person left in here. So I just need to identify who that person is. There are a variety of different ways you can tackle this, but in a literal attack on any data is in itself always a possibility. So it's that technical sense. We are now, the question where this gets covered in GDPR is in the means reasonably likely. Now, the scenario I've set up there is completely meaningless. Nobody's ever going to do that. So it's not something that is reasonably likely to be used. So that's where the question comes in. Now, if you're talking about data in the wild, then that becomes much more complex. And concerns about different types of data, which I think got raised by other speakers. So, for example, genomics data and photographs, which I think Robin mentioned in one of his comments. In order to make such data in and of themselves unidentifiable, one has to effectively destroy them. And so you then have to think about all this other stuff, the stuff that's surrounding those data. So my answer to my question is, if you're after an absolute technique, then don't release the data, don't do anything with the data. If you're wanting to manage risk, then anonymization can be incredibly effective. Okay.
Well, I remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I think thank you for addressing that comment. We are getting a mix of comments coming through, but I'm aware some of them are really for the panel discussion, so I'm not ignoring them. Don't worry. I'm just going to talk about one more that came up because I think this is specifically for you, Mark. It's from Basel Jennings, and he asks, what defines the limit of an environment? For example, with a single platform that is logically partitioned into secure compartments with different access controls constitute multiple environments?
A very good question. So we did talk a little bit about this in the book, but essentially, first of all, there's one big environment, so that's the world. And then all environments, as we might be thinking of them in this context, sit inside that environment. And so all the global environment is not irrelevant, partly because people move in and out of any secure environment that you set up, and they carry with them the knowledge that they have, including knowledge of other data. So that any environment you set up is not completely non-porous. Now, within any environment, so for example, an organization such as Roche, who we mentioned earlier on, that is an environment. Okay, it has its own context. There's some security controls just to get inside Roche. So that organizational environment is another environment. Inside that environment, there'll be servers, there'll be individual machines, there'll be specific software platforms. All of those two are environments. And any specific data will relate to environments at all levels in that hierarchy. So the partitioning, and we talk about partitioning, the partitioning is relevant. If you partition data off from other data, you are creating an environment. You can create an environment by soft controls as well. For example, a license creates an environment because there's a control over people's behavior. Any confidentiality boundary creates an environment. So if I agree with you that I won't share some data that you're, some information that you're sharing with me, there is an environment, a very, very soft one, around you and I. Okay, so environments are a flexible concept which can be applied to any arrangement, any boundary that is surrounding the data. So this is the confidentiality definition that I spoke about earlier on. So all of those processes and all of the subdivisions all count as environments. And then you talk about how effective those environments are in terms of controlling the flow of data.
Great, thank you very much, Mark. That's great, fantastic have this discussion going. And I think, so I'm just switching back to the chat. So yeah, great. So thank you, Basil, for your question. I think most of the comments coming through now are sort of a bit more general and really sort of, I'm sure other panel members would, other speakers would like to contribute to. So I think if it's okay, let's move on to the panel discussion. And I mean, I'm aware that it can sometimes seem a little bit one way, the conversation really, with people when people are typing. It might be nice if people, if I bring them in, if they're willing to ask a question over video or voice. I mean, just to feel like we have an audience. So I mean, obviously, I hope that's not putting people on the spot. I just thought of it really now. It's the first time I'm organising one of these, and I'm just aware that it sometimes feels like you're just speaking to the screen, which isn't the most interactive thing. So so there are various really great discussion questions, at least certainly from my point of view, to talk about. And apologies, I don't always have everyone's full name here. So so the first one, I think, but I did mention earlier that I'm sure the other speakers would like to say something about, is from Robert G. So apologies, I don't have his full surname here. So Robert, I know you were asking about GDPR for issues with regards to people that have died, and I was wondering if you wouldn't mind, saying it. I mean, it's your question, but if you want to elaborate on that beyond just having to type it out and things, it'd be really nice to hear that question from you.
Yeah, hi everybody. I hope you can hear me all right.
Yeah, we can hear you fine, thank you.
Yeah, I suppose it's something that's been in the back of my mind for a while as a practicing medical statistician, that there seems to be this kind of binary thinking. And actually the binary thinking is a problem that runs through all of this area. It's either anonymous or it isn't, and we know that's not true. It's and so that I suppose it made me wonder about what attitudes are regarding this. And actually, Nicola has kindly shared on the chat a link to a paper I didn't know about regarding stakeholder views on post-mortem use of medical data, and including genetics. But I suppose if you want to think about it more broadly, beyond just dead people, the issue is that there's a web of correlations, if you like, between individuals. So actually, the issue of confidentiality isn't so clear cut. And what I think it would be nice to try and achieve is an enhanced level of understanding of that among everyone who works with healthcare data and personal data more broadly. That it's never done and dusted, and I think that's something that Mark made absolutely crystal clear in his talk just now.
Thank you. That was great to elaborate on that, and I also have some thoughts on this as well, that just from what you were saying. But I won't say those right now. I want the speakers to, I'm sure they'll want to say some things. So the only tricky with online things is knowing how to schedule who speaks first. But if I guess I can see Nicola's videos on. So purely on that, I guess I'll say, Nicola, did you want to respond to any of those comments?
No, I think, thank you, Robert, very much for raising this issue. You're absolutely right. In the ethics space, there's been quite a lot of discussion about this in various ways. It's one of those issues that all I hope for is that people think, understand, and discuss. I mean, I have mixed feelings sometimes about this participatory stuff, but these kind of issues, we need people to talk, think, some kind of consensus in some way to come out about what we do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We have to think about it, and there are long repercussions. No, I'm afraid it's not very good. Yeah, but you're right. We have to think about it.
Thank you, Nicola. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to say about this?
Yeah, certainly. I realised that because my blinds were closed, because the sun was blinding me earlier on, that I was completely incognito in throughout my talk. And I've just pulled the blind out, and now you can just about see me. And anyway, so yeah, it's a really important issue. And one of the things that why we feel that when you're thinking about anonymization, you can't simply stop at legal definitions of data protection. And the issue of people being dead, well, actually, it doesn't apply in other jurisdictions anyway. This is a peculiarity of EU law, but in the US, that doesn't apply. But what came up in the chat earlier on about the relationship issue, which Robert's just elucidated further, is really important. So it just because I haven't found anything about you, or I think anything that's relevant about you, I may have found out something actually about somebody who's related to you or lives with you or so on, because actually we know social science has demonstrated quite avidly that people are very highly correlated on a whole range of dimensions with people that they are related to or live with or even live in the same area as. So the principle of homophony. And it gets discussed quite a lot. So we have group disclosure, class disclosure as a concept. And then secondly, then there's a set of ethical issues that actually sit outside the law. So the genetic responsibility to one's offspring. So there's people who are choosing to publish their genomes are possibly behaving irresponsibly in respect of their own children. Who knows what their consequences might be? We don't know down the line of that sort of behaviour. But these are ethical questions. Okay, so because they don't fall within GDPR because it's about people the data are not about. And data can have sensitivities for other people, even if there isn't that relational issue. So crime data. So if I find out that so and so has committed a particular crime, that is going to have consequences for that person's family, or potentially has consequences for that person's family as well as them individually. This again is not a data protection issue; it's an ethical issue. So the impact of a particular confidentiality breach may fall outside the specific realm of what is covered by data protection. So we do have to consider all of those things. And that's one of the reasons why we ask people not to get overly focused on the consequences of the actual specifics of the data that are sitting in front of them. And get obsessed by data structures and so on, which is the real essence of SDC. Those processes are important, but they're just a small element of the things you've got to think about. You've got to think about what are the risks? What is it? What's the thing I'm worried about happening? And how would that happen? What would have to happen in order for that to happen? And that's the thing I've got to stop. And that may cover a wider range of risks than the specific concern about re-identification of person X in data set Y. So yes, absolutely vital that we include that in our thinking.
Perhaps if I can just add something, a general point. There's one area in this field where we have a fairly good degree of consensus. Is in the case that you're doing research with family and you've got genomic data going on, which inevitably will be saying something about minors, or you're dealing with minors in a research project, that there's a lot of consensus that at the point that the minor becomes a major or becomes somebody who's competent to make their own decisions, that you do have a moral duty to let the minor decide for themselves, so that there's a strict limit perceived about what a parent can decide for their children, and that's accepted. And I know in a way we're talking about dead people, but there's still some kind of truth there, and I'm very much in favor of some kind of residual piety, respect for people who are dead and their thing. So you can't go back and ask somebody, you know, what would you like, unless you believe in seances, to do with your data. But I do think it's something where we have to have a degree of sensitivity, which is getting into very deontological and not particularly utility. But I do think we have to be very careful what we're doing and not just a roller coaster over people's feelings, particularly in an international thing, without having a discussion with stakeholders.
Thank you very much, both. I just taking Mark's analogy one step further, I suppose, or essentially that analogy where if a criminal just decided to self-declare that they were a criminal and I've done all these horrible things, they're in one sense within their rights to do that, but then it could have implications for their family, children, and so forth. So yes, so I think that there's so much to think about there, and from a statistical point of view, I haven't done much in this area, but the closest I can see to that is sort of network models, sort of where you try and model lots of dependencies in a complex way, just because there's so many dependencies there, rather than viewing them as sort of isolated, separate entities. But anyways, that's sort of me with my statistics hat on. But there's so many things to think about. Catherine, sorry, I know I haven't brought you in yet. I don't know if you wanted to say any more. I know you did say a little bit during your talk, but from your perspective in the pharmaceutical company, anything to think about?
Yeah, not probably much to add. I mean, just on a very practical level, although obviously we've been focusing on use of data, there are other laws relating to use of samples. I don't know much about that, but that's another element to this that may well be different from what we've talked about already. But also just to, I suppose, agree with what's been said already about the dangers of a very black and white approach. So many conversations that we have within Roche, and quite rightly, because they're not experts in this, people often are coming very focused on the data, as we've already said. They're thinking about that in isolation, rather than all the context of where that data is going to go to whom and why, and all the risks around that. So I mean, we're trying to spread the word and have these conversations with people, but I think that can often be the default way of thinking about it.
Great, thank you everyone. Robert, thank you very much for your questions. Well, I hope that discussions have proved interesting for you. So let's let me just go through. So I'm going through the chat just to see I bring in the right queries. So the next one I think is from Rob Davison, who's asking about. And firstly, greetings from Canada. Great to see we have some people from other countries here. That's fantastic. So so Rob is asking about protections for group privacy, especially vulnerable communities, and has given a link for what's happening in Canada. Rob, I don't know if you're comfortable to say a little bit more or elaborate on that for our speakers. It'd be nice to hear from you if you're able to do that.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hear you fine.
Excellent. Really, it's there was a lot of traction before COVID on talking about group privacy and particularly protecting vulnerable communities. And since then, most of the talk now is only around individual privacy, and it's missing sort of that concentration on both. It's not one or the other. It's really, how do you look at it in the context of protecting of different groups and communities, and one in particular that I draw example to is in Canada. The First Nations have come up with a set of principles for data sovereignty and data management called OCAP, and it's kind of what in the data community here in Canada we're kind of putting forward as a model to adopt, but it is difficult these days to try to get any sort of focus in on it. So I'm wondering if anybody else internationally has any experience with how to inject it into the COVID response narrative.
Yeah, really interesting point to discuss. Really, I'm sure our speakers will have thoughts on that. I guess we can keep it simple, keep the order the same. So Nicola, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much. As I said in the comments column, yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of work being done there, and I think we are absolutely clear, at least theoretically, that as soon as there are group, population, strata, repercussions, we really need to get people involved, and not just as but really involved. And this is certainly on paper the best thing. I've done a lot of work myself on things like community assent and stuff, which sounds a bit but I mean, it's really very, very important. You're absolutely right. I love your point about COVID data, and everything that's been said and written applies equally to COVID data. Yeah, I'm not aware of anything specific. I mean, certainly the mechanisms are there to make sure there's participation. And to be fair, COVID, we've rather focused on, well, there has been some work, hasn't there, on the black, what's the politically correct way of saying it? I mean, we are looking at it quite a lot. And I know that Roche have just published a very interesting paper, and there's quite a lot of work looking at least at the specific ethnic, social, economic groups and their specific issues and problems. So I think actually we're doing quite well with COVID, but there's certainly more to be done. And I know Roche have just published a paper a few days ago, some research they've been doing in this area. And it's great to see the commercial companies also going outside their commercial fields and taking time to do research into these areas as well.
Thank you, Nicola. I guess because you just mentioned Roche, it might make sense to bring Catherine in case she wants to say anything from the Roche perspective.
To be honest, I haven't really got much to add on that topic, but it's really interesting to hear that. I mean, I know that there's been an awful lot of discussion around how to ensure better representation of different populations in clinical trial recruitment. But yeah, I haven't got much else to add, but good to hear about it from Nicola.
Yeah, I just want to echo, this is such an important point. I haven't thought as much about it as in hindsight I really should have. I mean, because obviously we normally talk about risk and privacy for the individual, but there's all sorts of risks really, and vulnerable communities, ethnic minorities, are all very important issues to be thinking about here, and especially so with the COVID situation too. And as Nicola said, we are thinking about that more, which in hindsight, which actually is a good thing in that sense, and hopefully we can continue to think about it more outside of the COVID setting too. But Mark, oh, sorry, Nicola, yes.
Yeah, and as I tried to say in my presentation, that the whole thing about this big data innovation analytics is that we are identifying or generating new strata of individuals who are purported to have certain characteristics. And with this identification of a new strata because of this big data, there are absolutely responsibilities that come with that to make sure that we're not going into difficult areas of unfair discrimination, etc., etc.
Yeah, and actually, I did participate in one session that was held here in Canada on synthetic data and sort of how it can be used for COVID, which Roche was involved with, I believe, as well, in the presentation at least. And it's still at that point. Synthetic data is very good at protecting individuals, but not necessarily groups, because you can still identify and maybe discriminate against based on that data. And not all governments right now are acting nicely to all the various groups that they have within their country. So it is one of those questions that hopefully continues to be added to the narrative.
That's really interesting. It's something like maybe offline to follow up with you on that. But I know Mark as well. Both Mark and I certainly have a strong interest in it. And I can certainly see your point about how synthetic data does perhaps well enough for at the individual level, but for the group level, it gets challenging because, well, as Mark was saying in his talk, it gets to the point where you need to preserve utility, but then that does tie into groups. And so one common synthetic data method is using what's called tree-based methods, like classification trees, and they essentially group people into similar groups, which makes sense in terms of the statistics, but there are issues around sort of group privacy there. So that's really interesting. I'd like to follow that up with you, probably offline, I think, to find out more about that. Thank you. Mark, sorry, you might, I'm sure you
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, with territory we're moving into now is privacy rather than confidentiality. and which is, this is a discussion, so that's fine. It's not a criticism. Yeah, it's really a really critical point. So, I mean, the OCAP principles are essentially a set of privacy principles, and privacy is it's a hugely complicated topic. But it's essentially around the set of things that OCAP is focused on, to do with control and autonomy and ownership and all of those types of issues. And this plays out at the individual level as well. And essentially, you've got to be very careful thinking that you're solving a privacy problem by tackling a confidentiality problem. You may not. You may not solve the privacy problem at all. The two things are not, as I, in my bubble diagram earlier on, they're not the same things, and people may still have some significant concerns about how data are being used, even if you're meeting certain confidentiality standards. Yeah, absolutely. And how important that is, and where the boundaries of privacy boundaries are, will vary culturally. I mean, historically. Well, I do a completely different talk on this topic. I kind of talk about a village in the UK in the 1400s, and the individual was not very important. So individual privacy didn't really exist. But there's a massively strong privacy boundary around each village. So everybody in the village knew each other's business and what was going on, and who knew who. And if you read historical accounts of that across the world, you'll find very similar stories. I say a stranger comes into the village, they get absolutely nothing until they've been there for about 20 years, and it's the income problem. And so privacy boundaries were just defined differently, and that is true culturally as well. You go to different parts of the world, and what a privacy boundary means will be very different. What people do about their information, about their personal space, about their home, and it's just very different. So confidentiality doesn't care about these nuances. Okay, and that's the key point. And whether it's synthetic data or disclosure control or security or whatever you're doing, it's ignorant of that. It doesn't actually concern itself with that. And that's why you have to be very careful about thinking about confidentiality problems, which are important, and then thinking separately whether there are additional privacy issues. And they can come up at any level of analysis: individuals, families, households, neighborhoods, races, different cultural groups, and so on. So yeah, really important topic.
Great, thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much, Rob, for this for raising that and that topic with us. I hope this is useful to everyone listening in. So we do. So that's my. I'm going back to the chat. I'm trying to sort of. I'm trying to go in order of how they've come through. And there's been a sort of some other points in the middle, but I think that's what I want to do. So where are we? I think there was a question from Simon. I hope Simon is here. So he's asking about the benefits of being able to go back and track someone down, even though this was never expected. So finding patients who have specific gene mutation for which a therapy becomes available. So I don't know, Simon, if you wanted to elaborate on that. Or, yes, that would be great. Thank you.
Hi. Hi. Thanks very much. Sure. Yeah, it's just it's come up particularly in the context of rare diseases. I do lots of stuff there, where somebody may give a sample so we can do some epidemiological research, and they absolutely promise that we'll never be able to link this back to you. And then a few years down the line, some smart company comes up with a cure, or even, as I suggest there, a potential cure, and they want to do a trial in these particular patients, and we don't know who they are. We know they're out there, but we can't find them. So, just kind of looking at the problem from the other perspective, how do we manage this?
Yeah, Nicola, please feel free to start.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I also do a lot of space. Hi, Simon. I do a lot of work in the rare disease space as well for the NHS. I'm on their committee. I think you're absolutely right. I think the rare disease space is a context where people have quite a different attitude about privacy and data confidentiality, because your disease is rare, you want to share, you want people to know. You know, so I think it's a very good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, it's another one of those contexts which is very specific, and you can't generalize what is an appropriate privacy confidentiality position. You can't take the default for the rare disease, because this relies on knowing who's in the community, and the people who are in that community usually have an incredibly open, they say, I don't care a monkeys about who knows about me, I just want not to die, or my child not to die. Very, very good point. Yeah. I mean, I think I'm going to say a word which I didn't ever want to talk about today. We are going back to really boring things like informed consent forms. I'm sorry. And something I'm quite obsessed about. A lot of people complain about the length of informed consent forms, which is a good point. But it is, for me, for people who choose to read their informed consent forms, very, very important that it is in there that says, you know, if we do find an important secondary finding, you know, would you like us to get back to you, yes or no? And I think it really is important. And if people don't read it and choose to ignore it, all we can do as scientists is to give people the opportunity to say, yeah, please contact me if in this time something's found out which can help me or my child. So this whole thing about respecting the individual certainly has a role in here. And I think it's important to try and give people the choice that people can get back to them if they choose so, in case something happens in the future. But that's a very theoretical thing, and whether it's feasible in practice is different. But that's an important point. Thank you for raising it.
Maybe I can also. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I was just going to say, I mean, maybe another. So I really like that practical idea from Nicola. Maybe another way to think about it is, obviously there may be people. I agree with what Nicola said, that generally that it seems like patients are approaching this differently because of the nature of their disease or their child's disease. But maybe another way to approach it is through the patient advocacy groups that we often work with, such that you don't necessarily go straight back to that patient, which they may not want, but somehow, you know, you can have an intermediary where you can go back to them and say, right, we've got some news. We found something new. We are going to be doing a new trial. Can you talk to your people and do it in a sort of third party manner? But I think it's a really good point. I also had not really thought about that. So yeah, thanks for the question.
Sorry, the meeting was all about data privacy, and I was turning it around on its head and thinking about it.
I really like that you did that, because it's something, again, I always need things to think about in these meetings, which is great. And I was just thinking, yeah, it's almost like, you know, this is something where you want to be able to find these people, and it's probably a gross oversimplification, because I haven't had enough time to think about this, but it does seem like there's an element of common sense that has to sometimes apply here as well. But of course, there's that versus the legal framework and the other issues around it too. So yeah, no, really, really interesting point. Mark, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think Nicola's solution is in some sense the only feasible one. You have to think about this issue in advance. So I had friends, as one of 6 sisters, and the mother, their mother had CJD, which means it was a particular variety of it, which was genetic, and which means they all had a 50-50 risk of having it. And they could have a test to find out if they had the gene and therefore were going to develop it. And half the sisters chose not to, and half the sisters chose to. It was kind of really interesting, kind of weird little social experiment in a single family. So the point here was that, you know, if you know you're going to get it, you can do things to change your life and ameliorate the consequences of it, and you know, increase your lifespan essentially. And if you don't, then, you know, but that was in their individual choice. So that, I imagine in this situation, you go back and tell the patient some piece of information and they really would not want to know that. And there are other patients who really would want to know that. So I think the only solution you can have is to anticipate that this might be an issue with those sorts of data or those sorts of studies. And exactly as Nicola says, you've got to ask people and make it, absolutely transparent that you're asking them. It's not a difficult question to ask people. It's not like these really complicated issues they've got to think about data protection. It's, do you want to know if we've got some important medical information that we've extracted from the data? Do you want it to come back? So I think that's the only possible solution.
And this is standard in all serious informed consent forms. Thank you very much for that support. Thank you, Mark.
So Jean actually has raised the point on this, so just bringing that in now about layered consent, whether they can be whether they're happy to be contacted again, and that can be kept in a pseudo. So this is the first time I've actually seen it spelled as pseudo-anonymized, man. I know that people have been talking about. I always say pseudo-anonymized, but I'm not sure the right way to pronounce it. Jean, I don't know if you wanted to. Have you had any experience with these layered consent forms? If you're willing to come in to say something about that. I'm not sure if Jean is able to say anything, but she has raised the point about layered consent. So so it certainly does seem to be echoing Nicola's sort of idea, I think, which seems to be a good way to proceed. Okay. So a couple of other. Sorry, I know we are overrunning, so I apologise for that. If people are able to stay on, I think it's great to have this discussion. So I'm really pleased we're having this discussion. So there are a couple of other comments or questions that have been raised.
Sorry.
One is from.
Sorry, it's Jean there. I couldn't get get through. Sorry about that. I'm actually sort of very experienced in this because I'm actually, as a statistician, I'm on lots of ethics committees. I'm mad, absolutely crazy, but I'm actually very interested in this. And even more than that, I actually work in the UK and in Ireland. And I'm very, very involved in ethics within Ireland. They've had all sorts of problems with GDPR. I won't go into all that. But the fact is that we have now established consent forms where we do have layered consent on most forms, particularly in hospital research and clinical trials. And it just goes down in different layers. And then you have these questions towards the end. Are you happy to be contacted in the future? Are you happy for your data to be used in future research into this area? All this sort of thing. And it's a very useful thing because each person, is allowed to choose whichever of those they're willing to do. And it just means you then have a record of the people who want to be contacted again in the future for either extra research or even for, giving them information later. So it can be done. And as long as you have a pseudonymized list, and it is pseudonymized, by the way, and I've noticed recently in applications coming to us, they keep putting pseudo-anonymized. That is not the word, sorry, but it seems to have become the word because everyone's using it. So I'm sort of going through application forms now and editing them because it just annoys me. It's pseudonymized. It took me ages to learn that word, and now they're trying to invent a new one. But basically, that this can be done. It's a very useful tool, and for any studies certainly that I advise on, I always try to get them to do this, and it gives them a lot more power later to actually get the data and information back to people. Because at the end of the day, we want them to be, if we find something new, we want them to know,
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah, definitely. It makes great sense. But thank you. So thank you very much, Jean. That's really great to hear your experience there. Right. So I'll just move on. Sorry, because we have a few other questions, but thank you for that question as well from Simon. So Mohammed is asking a question on data risk and anonymization, but it has a cost over data utility. So how do you decide at what level should anonymization be applied while retaining data utility? Are there any heuristic rules? Mohammed, I don't know if you wanted to come in to elaborate on that at all, if you have any experience yourself or with anything you've done. Okay, I think if you do want to come in at any point, do let me know. But maybe I'll start with Mark here because he might like to say something there.
Yeah, I mean, obviously this is a very important topic. Thinking about the trade-off. It got discussed a lot in the statistical disclosure control community. And there's been some advances recently in actual measurement of these two things against each other, and thinking about how you might actually optimize trade-off. Some of the decisions you might make are measurements of utility in a statistical sense might not capture the real meaning of utility, which is, can the analyst do what they want to do with the data? Okay, this is about being able to carry out the analysis that you need to carry out. So you can do that in a variety of ways, and some of them are not quantifiable. So some of it is done by simple things like finding out what your user community want the user data for. So the census does this quite a lot. And decisions were made about an earlier census, so we're going back to, I think, 2001 now, where they just analysed what the data had been used for the previous census round, and they found out that essentially they had one particular variable in the data, which is actually throwing up massive risk, according to our analyses, but was hardly used at all by the user community, and that was industry, which had an enormous amount of detail on it. I think it was about 78 categories or something of that sort. And so they decided to reduce the amount of information about that considerably. So there was not a great cost in terms of utility, even though in terms of the actual information was reduced. So there's a lot of complexity there in terms of thinking about what do we mean by utility and how do we go about measuring that, and is something which is still actually quite at an early stage of development.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. You know, actually, Mark has done a lot of work in this area, and I've looked into it, and I think I really like linking back to Mark's talk about the sort of data situation. Really, I think it sort of has relevance there. Really, what do people want to do with the data? What is the data being used for? And that applies from a risk as well as a utility point of view as well, I would say. So I think it's very challenging, but there are ways to. So there are global metrics, I think, around, but again, you've got to question sometimes how relevant they would be in many different settings. So they're useful sometimes from a mathematical point of view to have some nice mathematical properties, but then it comes back to the actual what do you want to do with the data. So it normally always comes back to that, I would say. But yeah, Nicola, did you want to say anything about this, or you're okay? All right. Catherine, sorry.
Yeah, I was just to follow up really on what Mark said. So remember I mentioned right at the end the work that we did with UCAN in the context of publication of clinical study reports on the website of the EMA and Health Canada. So one of the things that we discussed as part of trying to work through the data situation is that the actual Mark mentioned about understanding what researchers want to do with the data. It was really hard to even know what the answer was to that, because there were lots of reasons why these documents were being published that weren't necessarily just to do with researchers taking these documents, but also transparency of EMA's decision making to do with drug applications. So it was very hard to pin down what really was important when we publish these documents, what's important for researchers and how they might even interact with what are thousands and thousands of pages of PDFs. So yeah, I mean, that's still an issue, but it was, I think, this idea of understanding what's important to the downstream users of that data and having that as part of your thinking is really important.
That's really interesting to get the perspective from a pharmaceutical point of view. Really, really interesting. Thank you. Okay. So we are having more comments, which is great. If we're able to, it'd be great to go through these. This is actually a really really nice question from Rebecca. it's sort of just linked to the it does link to the sort of eternal question really is, which is so Rebecca's basically saying that this is a self-selected group. We're already interested in privacy. So how much do you think the broader stats community think about these issues, and what could we be doing to raise awareness? Rebecca, I don't know if you want to come in and say any more about that, if you've had any experience yourself about how the broader stats community think about this. Hi, Rebecca.
Well, hi. Not really. I think the question is kind of what it is, and I think it's also interesting to hear, how submissions to ethics committees are getting pseudonymized with, pseudo-anonymized. So I think it's just going forward. This feels like a very important topic, and there is a much bigger denominator of statisticians working in the medical space, not just in the UK but beyond. But yeah, what can we be doing to kind of make this, perhaps raise awareness, because people don't know what they don't know.
Thank you. That's great. Who wants to start? I mean, Nicola, do you want to say anything about this?
Yeah, I mean, very, very good point. Beautifully made, Rebecca. You're right. I mean, doing a bit of bashing of the old drum. I mean, come on, RSS. But I think you're making a good point, Rebecca. At the moment, where people are talking about our values, although they're making a cup of tea, this is somehow a great opportunity with the zeitgeist at the moment to get statistics more to the front, isn't it? Because I think we've got people's attention, and we've got the algorithm mess with the A levels, etc. How we use the momentum of having open ears, I don't know. And I do suggest that the professional organisations have a huge amount of work to do, although of course precisely the time when funds are low. I don't know, Rebecca, what do you think?
I can come in on this one if you want, Robin.
Yeah, sure.
I think this is a really interesting question, and I wouldn't just include statisticians in this. So, I mean, working as a data scientist, I would say, there's a disciplinary engagement with the topic of confidentiality and privacy is extremely varied. One of the worst groups I've found is geneticists. Actually, they've got a very particular, they've had a very particular take on it. I think it's just that seems to have been at a particular stage, which is about 15 years behind everyone else, because they went through this kind of massive swing, which I've observed in other areas, including statistics, where they start off with an overly liberal approach and then end up locking everything down and going really conservative. So it's almost like a sort of, seems like a developmental cycle. And computer scientists are another group which I have some concerns about, in terms of sort of disciplinary engagement with this topic. So there's a range of different perspectives. I think there's one of the really important elements of the way we built our framework was to get all those people around the table. Now, admittedly, they were themselves a self-selected group to a certain extent, but those perspectives are very, very different in terms of engagement. Whereas I actually think within the statistics community, particularly social statistics, there is a general understanding, at least, of the issues, and I don't think it's a very closed community to understanding those, whereas I think some of the other scientific areas are not really comprehending those particular questions at all. So that's my view anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it's quite a wide issue in science in general, and it might actually sadly be sometimes these things only come to the fore when some sort of disaster happens, where sort of the right procedures weren't being thought about or followed in, and something or weren't even developed, and something happens like a data leak or some privacy breach, and then everything begins, and it's sort of trying to get ahead of the curve, as it were, and stop those from happening. Maybe one thought is to sort of tell people, look, worst case scenarios, what things could go wrong here, what consequences could they have? But yeah, we do definitely need that engagement. I agree. Catherine, I don't know from a pharmaceutical perspective what you have on this.
Yeah, I mean, well, full disclosure, Rebecca is my boss, so I better give a good answer. But I think that what I find is there is increasing awareness now within not just the stats community, but broader within data science and scientists. But I also find that people seem to swing between extremes of either not knowing anything or being extremely nervous and afraid of anything they, almost needing permission to do anything. And neither of those is a good state to be in. I think that having some basic knowledge and awareness of some of the things I talked about, how do privacy laws apply to the things that we do with data in the pharma industry is really important. And even just having a bit of basic knowledge, I think, can help people. One of the things I've often suggested when I talk to colleagues who perhaps are working on particular IT projects, I don't mean people in IT, but statisticians or data scientists, is, take a look at the GDPR principles and think about them in relation to the things that you're planning and doing and thinking about, and are there things that stand out where you think, oh, that doesn't sound quite right, or that's something we need to think more about, because they're quite good general guiding principles, as the name suggests. So, I think there's still more work to do, but it is better than it was. Let's put it that way.
Thank you very much, Catherine. That's great. I'm aware we are quite over, but there is one last comment. So if it's okay, we could hopefully have a chat about this as well. So this is from Dominic. He says opting out of any future data sharing using optional consent questions can make sharing individual participant level data sets, even if pseudonymized, restricted or incomplete. Increased requirements and pressure from funders and scientific community to share data seems at odds with empowering participants to be able to opt out of future sharing. Both are important. How do we satisfy both? Well, it's a tough question. I know from experience that when we publish papers and if they're funded research, you have to share the data. You need to share share all the essentially reproducible research, which is where the angle I've seen it coming from. I know there's also all sorts of angles there from that question, but I don't know. But let's ask the panel. Let's see what they make of it. Nicola, what do you?
Thank you. Great question. Yeah, I've done a lot of work and thinking in this area, and it's a very good question, because if the ethical issues that we have, basically, there's one conflict of some kind of interest, is that where we talk about utility and utilitarian and the hard results, that's really, really important. But you've also got the deontological aspect that, however much it sometimes can be baffling to oneself, if we start not respecting, unless you've got a public health pandemic, but on the whole, we have to respect people's autonomy, unless there is a public health pandemic going on, etc., etc. Because the definition of freedom and democracy in a society within certain limits is precisely the freedom to be a bit silly and not very logical, and to take decisions that you or I may think are simple, are a bit silly. So it's incredibly important that people do have the option to say no to research and to opt out and say, I'll do this, but I don't want anything else. They don't have to explain their own opinions. And when I'm working with big pharmaceutical companies and you're designing a clinical trial or data sets, one really has to be well advised if you're using these complex consent, which are really respecting the rights of people, however strange some of their opinions may be about what they want or don't want. That's the whole point about autonomy, freedom to be not very, a bit silly, is that we have to make sure we've got the data samples that are big enough to have a bad case scenario that a certain number of people will be ticking the boxes in the consent form and mean that the utility of the data is little. This, of course, is a problem where you've got rare diseases, etc., etc. But I think it's a very good point. And I think we have to satisfy both, unless, as I said, we've got a public health pandemic and we've got a plague coming, and then the individual rights have to be secondary. We must satisfy both. Otherwise, what society are we living in?
Thank you very much, Nicola. Sorry, Dominic, I realized that I meant to ask if you wanted to say anything to elaborate on that at all. If you're there, if you wanted to say something before we ask the others to do this.
No, it was a long-winded question as it is, and you did well to read it out, so thanks. And that was a very good answer from Nicola. So yeah, I think it's clear that it always needs to be in there, and it needs to be dealt with at the end of the trial by removing it, and hopefully that has minimum impact. So I'm happy with that, bar COVID.
So thank you, Dominic. Catherine, did you want to say anything on that?
I suppose just to follow up on what you said, Robin, about making data available for the purposes of reproducing the analyses then can become problematic. I know that when, sort of on the flip side of that, when we started data sharing years ago, sharing patient level data through sort of secure platforms, one of the thoughts was that the vast majority of requests would be about reproducing, but in fact, the vast majority are about other things, new science or new research rather than reproducing analyses. I mean, if you think about the data sharing example I had about publication of documents, that then gets a bit tricky. If you've got sort of patients as part of a massive clinical trial report, does that count as secondary use? And if it does, then how would you remove individual patients from it? I mean, I don't even know what that would mean or look like. So yeah, there's definitely things to be worked through there. And also, what's the role of anonymisation versus the informed consent language in the first place? So
great, thank you very much, Catherine. Yes, I agree. Lots to think about. Mark, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on the example that Catherine was just talking about, I mean, there's a very straightforward problem with that particular example, because actually it's not within Roche's capacity to remove individual people from the data set, because they literally don't know who they are, because the data that they've got are in fact pseudonymized before we even got to that stage. So actually, it's one of those situations where you go, well, I could either not publish this whole report, which I'm legally bound to do, or I could publish the report and I ignore this person's request. So there are some kind of tensions here, and of course a lot of these things are very messy in how they're actually sorted out. I mean, this is the essence of this particular problem with these clinical study reports, is that we've got one law which says, GDPR, which says, all this stuff about protecting individual level data, and then we've got another law which is the EMA's founding law, I guess, which says you've got to publish these reports, and there's good reason for both of those things, and it's always a bit of a fudge sorting out which way it's going to fall in any particular circumstance. In general, I agree with the point Nicola raised earlier on. I mean, essentially, autonomy is absolutely fundamental to democracy. If you don't have autonomy, you don't have democracy, and that's the end of that. So if you want to live in a democracy, you have to give people choices, and they have to have personal control over things that are important to them. And that sometimes has consequences that actually you may prefer or otherwise. But we've made that particular choice. And it's noteworthy that the countries that were most successful in locking down the pandemic were the East Asian countries, where they're essentially not democratic. I've had some particular dealings with Singapore myself, so I'm, for example, aware of the systems that they've used in order to track and trace, and I'm not surprised they were effective. But of course, in order to deliver that sort of functionality, they are not a strong democracy. So, we've chosen to be a democracy. That's a choice I would personally still support. And if we want that, we can't have as much of the other thing as we want to. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, no, very interesting views, and I guess coming back to the COVID setting and how different systems do things differently. I mean, I think Mark, your point about two different laws which have equal sort of value in some senses in different contexts. But the problem is that it's almost like there needs to be more conversations happening at a higher level to sort, at least in my view, to sort these things out so that it's more consistent and more complete, I guess. That may be too much to ask for.
Yeah, you wave your magic wands there.
So, but anyways, on that happy note, so it's been really wonderful to listen to these talks from. I'm sure I hope that everyone here enjoyed this talk and the session. It's been great to have all these discussions going forward as well. I was always a bit nervous in an online setting, would we get enough discussion, but we certainly seem to. And apologies for overrunning, but at least we did get a lot of discussion, which is good. So I think we should end it there. Thank you very much, everyone. Again, just to say, the session is recorded, and if you didn't want your contribution to be made available, so please email us and let us know as soon as possible after the event. Within about 2 weeks, we'll be trying to make this session available. Yeah, and if you want to follow up on this, I'm sure our speakers, I'm certainly very happy to discuss further after this. So we'll be happy to hear your thoughts on anything that was discussed here. But thank you, everyone. Thank you to the speakers. Thank you very much, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you as well. Thank you, Robin.
No problem. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Okay then.
Thanks.
Bye, everyone. Bye.
Wine time. Bye-bye.
Bye.